This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything. Oh, yeah.
Welcome to this clean-cut episode of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, August 18th, 2016. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Today's episode is part 2 of the Mark Hofmann story. If you missed part 1 and want to hear what happened previous to this episode, might I suggest going back and listening to the first part. If you're all caught up, or you don't mind picking up in the middle of a story, then this is the episode for you. Let's get started. In December of 1983, Mark Hofmann sold the Salamander letter to two men named Stephen Christensen and Gary Sheets. Once it was publicized that the letter existed and the church was attempting to buy it for the purposes of suppressing its contents, the price was set at $40,000. Now, those are $1985. That's significantly more. That's much closer to $100,000 now. Christensen was the primary investor, while Gary Sheets was brought in to finance a secondary document that was added to the Salamander letter to sweeten the deal. Now, Christensen was the main guy who was dealing with the Salamander letter, who also ended up, donating the letter to the church. So his name appears most frequently when discussing the Salamander letter. But keep in mind that Gary Sheets was still involved with buying the Salamander letter from Hofmann, as well as an 1825 letter between Joseph Smith and Josiah Stowell. And what I'm about to read is taken from Chasing the White Salamander on utlm.org, so be sure to check the show notes for a link to this chapter of the book. Quote, after Mark Hofmann sold the letter to Stephen Christensen, Christensen and Hofmann agreed to split the cost of $6,000 to have the letter authenticated by Kenneth Rendell, a rare book dealer recommended by Hofmann. Rendell is an important name, remember Kenneth Rendell. Mr. Rendell examined the letter and sent it to other experts for their opinions. He was unable to find any evidence of forgery. At the preliminary hearing, he testified that when he examined the letter, he felt that it was authentic, but could not actually prove that this was the case. Now quoting Rendell, first of all, I did not determine authenticity. I dealt with the question of authenticity, but I did not determine it to be genuine. Back to the book. Rendell said that there was no material to compare the handwriting with, although he was given a few Martin Harris signatures. I did compare the signatures to 4 or 5 signatures, but frankly, I couldn't rely on the signatures. As I have already shown, after Kenneth Rendell saw other forgeries, Mark Hofmann had sold and found out that Lynn Jacobs had admitted that he fabricated a story as to how the Salamander letter was obtained. He began to have doubts with regard to its authenticity. At the preliminary hearing, he stated, if someone came to me with this letter in this context, I would not buy it. I could not offer it as probably being genuine. He also said that he would not sell this letter. Mr. Rendell claimed that he was unable to find a relationship between the Salamander letter and the other forgeries, but if there is one, it's in the ink. And I don't do ink analysis. That's out of my area. And now it passes on to being a question of ink. End quote. So Kenneth Rendell was the main guy who was hired to examine the Salamander letter to detect any outright signs of forgery. And there weren't any. The Salamander letter was passing tests left and right. Rendell took some of Harris's documents, including some signatures, and then compared them to the Salamander letter. But There simply wasn't enough Harris material from earlier than 1830 to compare it against. Also, it should be noted that some of the Harris signatures he was using to compare against the Harris signature on the Salamander letter were possibly manufactured by Hofmann already. I mean, Rendell may have been using Hofmann forgeries to substantiate a Hofmann forgery. The waters of Mormon history at this time were a little muddy. This could be one main reason why the letter didn't stand out as a forgery until many hours of research and comparison had gone into determining it. We'll get into that eventually once the discovery was made that the forgeries were actual forgeries. But for now, let's just get up to that point. There were some signs in the letter that Hofmann couldn't hide. The Salamander was a legitimate piece of paper that was held by Christensen or the church or anybody who would examine it, meaning that the letter would undergo some very serious scrutiny. And Hofmann must have known this to make such a high-quality forgery. It wasn't just text that people were reviewing, it was an actual piece of paper. With the letter being a real piece of paper, though, Hofmann had to manufacture it somehow. In doing so, people found that there were cut marks on the side of the paper that looked like they were made with scissors cut from a larger piece of old paper, which wouldn't have been expected with typical paper in the 1830s, typical letter paper like this. Also, when it was examined under a microscope, the ink that Hofmann used had some very unusual cracking that wasn't seen on any other legitimate historical documents from this same time. The cracking was probably a byproduct of whatever process Hofmann used to make the paper look aged or pressed as if it had actually existed for 150 years, and actually served to be an identifying feature in investigating his forgeries after he was convicted. The whole time that many people were, reeling from the discovery and the publication of the Salamander letter in, early 1984, Hofmann was cooking up other forgeries and deals to keep him secure in his admittedly lavish lifestyle. Gerald Tanner of the Utah Lighthouse Ministries began popularizing the idea that the Salamander letter was a forgery and a document forger was out there somewhere around April of 1984. While the following August Sunstone Symposium is where the discussion really began to open up about the legitimacy of the Salamander letter. So let's pick up on Hofmann's timeline from when the Tanners introduced into the public sphere that the Salamander might be a forgery. We're going to pick up in May 18th, 1984. Mike Hansen, who was actually an alias for Hofmann, Mike Hansen, Mark Hofmann, that's kind of creative, right? He ordered some printing plates from the Cox and Clark engraving in Denver, Colorado for Deseret currency. Now, Deseret currency is the paper money that they used in Utah when they first settled it after 1847 up until they began using more dollars. The Deseret currency is just what they used for a small amount of time there. In June of 1984, Mike Hansen ordered 12 zinc etchings from William Clayton's Latter-day Saints Immigrant's Guide, dated 1848, and it was from Heisler Engraving in Kansas City, Missouri. Part of the $389 order was paid with a check for $169 that was signed by Mark Hofmann instead of Mike Hansen. So that was kind of a problem. When you're ordering etchings or, plates to print money and you're using the alias of Mike Hansen, it doesn't help when you sign a check with Mark Hofmann. But on to August 1984, Hofmann sells a full set of Deseret currency that was dated 1858 to a man named Alvin Rust for $35,000. So it took him from the middle of May to when he ordered the plates from Colorado to August of 84, he was able to sell the currency that he printed for $35,000. That's remarkable turnaround in investment. From August 21st to 24th was the Sunstone Symposium. It was hosted at the Hotel Salt Lake in Salt Lake City. First public discussion of the 1830 Harris letter, the Salamander letter, was given by Jan Ships and Richard Bushman at this time. And on August 22nd, during that symposium, the Tanners, Gerald and Sandra Tanner of the Utah Lighthouse Ministry, published the Money Digging Letters. Now that was the pamphlet wherein Gerald Tanner argued against the legitimacy of the Salamander letter, and Sandra argued for it. You can order that pamphlet online. I think it's like 30 pages or something off of utlm.org. So here in August of 1984, this is when people really started to, popularize the discussion of things coming from Hofmann might be forgeries. And that's also when it entered the larger public sphere, because on August 25th, Los Angeles Times, LA Times, a major national news agency, published a long article talking about the Harris letter, and other newspapers from across the country followed their lead. So in September of the year, Utah Lighthouse Ministries published a copy of the circulating typescript of the 1825 Smith and Stowell letter, and questions why the 1830 Harris letter is devoid of mention of God or angels, just like they had done at the Sunstone Symposium in the money digging letter, right? So this 1825 Smith and Stowell letter, this is the cherry that was put on top of the salamander letter deal that was made with Stephen Christensen. Because of the 1825 Smith and Stowell letter requiring another $15,000, that's why Gary Sheets was brought in onto the deal of the salamander letter with Stephen Christensen and the church. And that's where this letter was published. Utah Lighthouse Ministries actually started publishing a copy of the 1825 letter between them. Now, that's a problem because the church denied that it happened. The church denied that they had it. But the UTLM had a typescript of it. They had all of the text of it, and they published it in their own newsletter. So that created another problem. Now, on September 26th of 1984, Hofmann learns from Kenneth Rendell. Remember, that's that name, Kenneth Rendell. He was the guy that initially examined the salamander letter, that a man named William G. Kruger, who was a forensic examiner of paper, had determined there were no indications of forgery in the 1830 Harris letter, the salamander letter. So it had passed another forensic examiner that said, yeah, this seems pretty legit. It doesn't show any outward signs of being a forgery. So it was passing tests with experts everywhere. It's not like the salamander letter just fooled the church leadership. No, there were experts all over in multiple fields of study that were looking at this thing, examining it at a microscopic level, and not seeing any signs of forgery. So, moving on to October 1984, in an address at General Conference, Elder Bruce R. McConkie warns members who conduct or support historical research threatening to the faith of other members. We'll listen to that in a second, but 3 days later, Christensen fires a man named Brent Metcalf from his research team, but gives him severance pay. Now, Metcalf, that's an interesting name, Brent Metcalf. He's actually been on Mormon Stories before, and he has 4 very interesting episodes on Mormon Stories. But after he was fired from Christensen's research team, he went to work for Hofmann. I'm not sure exactly what he was doing, but he went to work for Hofmann. But it says after that, Metcalf had filled in for Christensen in giving a talk to the faculty at the LDS Institute of Religion at the University of Utah. This discussion had become very heated over Metcalf's refusal to bear his testimony to the group after discussing the Harris letter. Basically, what had happened was the LDS Institute of Religion at the University of Utah was discussing the salamander letter. And Brent Metcalf said, I can't bear my testimony that the church is true because this salamander letter is creating a crisis, a faith crisis in me. So the discussion became heated, and that is what caused Christensen to fire Brent Metcalf. So it was very, tensions were rising when it came to this salamander letter. Things were really, really tense in people, believing members and non-believing historians. But after that, Christensen wrote a letter to President Hinckley on October 16th, in which he said that he's decided to suspend research on the letter and drop plans to publish a book about the salamander letter. This is huge because this is almost an admission of defeat on Christensen's part. He was working with Ronald Walker and Dean Jesse on, possibly coming up with apologetics that could explain how the salamander letter fits into the narrative of Mormonism, basically, of Mormon history. And, Christensen wrote this letter to President Hinckley and said, I can't do it anymore. It's too much in conflict with what I believe about the church. I can't do any more research on this letter, and I'm not going to publish a book about it. Dean Jesse ended up publishing about the salamander letter, but it wasn't a book. It was more of a pamphlet than anything, where he discussed the letter in a few pages. We're going to read from it here pretty soon. But to go back to what it said earlier there, we're going to listen to the audio of Bruce McConkie's talk in General Conference there. The timeline that I'm reading from said that he, warned members who conduct or support historical research threatening to the faith of other members of the church. And it's very, very important to listen to. The talk is titled "The Caravan Moves On," and it's the property of the church, I have to say this, and it's used for critique and educational purposes only, falling under the Fair Use Clause of Creative Commons licensing. I extracted the audio from the church's official General Conference YouTube channel, and there's a link for it in the show notes, and I encourage everybody to chase that link and watch the entire 18-minute long video. To describe it, in this video, you'll hear how the church is trying to paint people that were constructing the narrative of Joseph Smith being a treasure hunter. The leadership was afraid that something like this, the Salamander Letter, was an existential threat to the church. So McConkie gets up on the stand and tells us what true Latter-day Saints are supposed to do.
On every issue, it behooves us to determine what the Lord would have us do and what counsel He has given through the appointed officers of His earthly kingdom. No true Latter-day Saint will ever take a stand that is in opposition to what the Lord has revealed to those who direct the affairs of His earthly kingdom. No Latter-day Saint who is true and faithful in all things will ever pursue a course or espouse a cause or publish an article or book that weakens or destroys faith. There is, in fact, no such thing as neutrality where the gospel is concerned. Jesus said, "He that is not with me is against me, and he that gathereth not with me scattereth abroad." And it was Jacob who said, "They who are not for me are against me, saith our God." If we do not sustain and uphold and support the kingdom of God in all things, we are thereby aiding a cause other than the Lord's. Only the valiant are saved. Members of the church who are not valiant in the testimony of Jesus, not valiant in the cause of Christ, not valiant in defense of His prophets and in preaching His word, are not heirs of the celestial kingdom.
McConkie said it pretty straightforward there. No Latter-day Saint that is true and faithful in all things will publish any article, book, or material that weakens or destroys faith. There's simply no way of getting around the logical block that was put in place by this talk by Bruce McConkie. If anybody that was studying the Salamander Letter published a book or any material that wasn't faith-promoting or didn't spin the news of the letter in a way that was faith-promoting, they could easily fall into that category of those people that are aiding a cause other than the Lord's, as McConkie said. This is simply a chastisement of anybody seeking further knowledge into historical studies, only thinly veiling how much the leadership was at a loss for proper solutions to the Salamander Letter that was gaining traction in the public sphere. Near the end of 1984, Dean Jesse, the Mormon historian, released the pamphlet discussing the 1825 letter from Joseph Smith to Josiah Stowell and the Salamander Letter. Now, this is what I talked about just a second ago, but 3 pages of this pamphlet were dedicated to the 1825 letter, but the remaining 20 pages are dedicated to discussing the Salamander Letter. This gives us an idea of just how much scrutiny and examination the letter was barraged with, but it passed every single one of these tests. There will be a link to the entire pamphlet hosted on BYU's online library in the show notes, and I recommend looking that up. This is taken from New Documents and Mormon Beginnings, starting with page 405. Quote, Rendell concluded there is no indication that this letter is a forgery. The text of these reports on the tests conducted in 1985 is reproduced on page 422 to 424. In connection with these tests and other observations, the following information is relevant. Number 1. now it goes through an itemized list of what's relevant about the salamander letter. Number 1. The letter, which measures 8 13/16 by 11 9/16, is written on both sides of a single sheet of machine-lined paper, and, if authentic, would be among the earliest samples of machine-lined paper. Tests show the paper to be consistent with other samples of the time period. According to Rendell, there's Kenneth Rendell again, there is a possibility it was manufactured at the Nathaniel Rochester paper mill, built in 1810 at Dansville, New York, near Palmyra. So if that's where the paper came from, that would make sense. If this was a letter that was written in 1830 by Martin Harris, this guy, Rendell, concluded that it was possibly manufactured in New York near Palmyra 20 years earlier. I mean, that's perfectly in line with what we'd expect to find with a letter that was written in 1830, right? Number 2, the type of ink used to write the letter was determined by chemical testing. Minute samples of the ink were removed from the letter and observed by microscope under the effect of chemical reagents. The ink was determined to be of the iron gall type in wide use at the date appearing on the letter. So they scraped off little chunks of ink from the paper and they put it under chemical reagents to see what kind of ink they was used in writing the letter. And they said, well, it's an iron gall type ink, and that's what was used at the time. So, well, that makes perfect sense. It's perfectly in line with what we'd expect if the letter were authentic. Number 3, before envelopes came into common use about 1845, letters were sent by folding the written sheet into a small size secured with a wax seal, then addressed and stamped with a hand stamp on the outside surface. Opening a letter would often leave a small hole or tear caused by the breaking of the seal, and creases made by the original folds. The wax seal, which produced the hole in the paper when the Harris letter was opened, and the missing paper that adhered to the wax match perfectly. So that's what would happen. Before 1845, instead of sending things in letters, people would just fold a piece of paper on top of itself and then put a wax seal in the middle of it. And then when the person would open it, it would oftentimes rip a little tiny hole out of the letter, and that little chunk of paper would be stuck to the wax once they unfolded it. And that matched perfectly on the Harris letter. So, really, as a forgery, it was a Class A high-quality forgery. That's what we're getting from this. Number 4, the double-line oval Palmyra hand-stamped postmark on the Harris letter matches in size, color, and wording the postmark on letters mailed at Palmyra, New York between 1829 and 1834. So that basically they examined the actual postmark of the letter to see if it was conducive with 1829 to 1834 letters that were mailed in Palmyra. And they said, well, it matches perfectly. So there was nothing, no telltale signs that looked like a forgery. In fact, it looked more authentic because it was perfectly in line with what they would expect. Number 5, the number 6 on the address panel, designating the 6-cent cost for sending the letter, agrees with the zone rate in effect in 1830 for sending a single sheet a distance of not more than 30 miles. The 6 is written in a different color ink than the rest of the letter. See photo reproduction on page 421. So there's, the 5th criteria. They looked at the postmark and said, okay, how much would it have costed in 1830 to send a letter the distance of, less than 30 miles from Palmyra to wherever William Wines Phelps was in Canandaigua. And they said, yeah, 6 cents. That's perfectly what we would expect. And it's written in a different color ink, meaning that, when they went to the post office or whatever, that's when they purchased the postmark for it. And that's what they would expect if the letter were legitimate. So, it goes on to conclude, while the foregoing observations show the Harris letter to be consistent with other writings of the time period and illustrate a number of technical requirements necessary if one were to try and duplicate a letter written in 1830, they do not prove Harris authorship. The question of authorship ultimately rests upon an analysis of the handwriting. So there we go. That was Dean Jesse's, 5-point deconstruction of what makes the letter look authentic. And it's really hard to argue with all of those. If everything that he just listed off, if all of those points were hit on and the salamander letter checks out as being legitimately written in 1830 by Martin Harris, it's really hard to conclude that it was a forgery if it passes all of those tests. Especially when you're looking at a chemical analysis of, is this an ink that was used at the time? Hofmann didn't exactly make it with a ballpoint pen. That's what important to think about here. Now, I should note that on the last few pages of that pamphlet, and please check it in the show notes, a large number of the photocopies of the documents that are contained include 12 Martin Harris signatures. One of the documents and 5 of those signatures were forgeries by Hofmann that Dean Jesse was using to compare and validate the Salamander letter. Like I said, the history was muddled at this time. Hofmann forgeries were everywhere, and people were having a hard time distinguishing what was what at that time, so people would use Hofmann forgeries to validate other Hofmann forgeries. He was deviously genius about this. Now, the best part about all of this is, what Hofmann was doing while scholars and historians were arguing about the legitimacy of his work. It's almost as if the church's troubled PR campaign to deal with the information in the Salamander letter had absolutely no effect on Hofmann. He was still manufacturing letters, banknotes, and nearly anything else possible that would fetch a significant price. Hofmann was riding the bubble in this market that he was creating, and the bubble was still inflating. So nearing the end of 1984, Hofmann seemed to kind of decrease his dealings in Mormon history and, antique Mormon documents and increase his forgeries in other historical realms. By no means did he completely stop with Mormon forgeries. I mean, they were his specialty, so he couldn't just abandon that world. But he began to really increase the number of other historical documents he was producing. So on October 30th, 1984, Wilfred Cardin sent Hofmann a check for $12,000 for an 1807 Betsy Ross letter that he had forged. On October 30th, the same day, Mike Hansen, of course we know as an alias for Mark Hofmann, Mike Hansen, Mark Hofmann, makes sense, ordered a Jim Bridger note from the Utah Engraving Company. So on October 30th, he ordered the notes for the Jim Bridger signatures here. Now on November 21st, Mike Hansen again, not Mark Hofmann, Mike Hansen orders printing plate for Emma Smith hymnal back page from the DeBuzik Engraving Salt Lake City Company. So it took a mere week because on November 28th, he sold an Emma Smith hymnal to Brent Ashworth for $5,000 and a trade for a Brigham Young letter. So it took him 1 week to publish an Emma Smith hymnal that he had ordered an engraving plate for, and he sold it for $5,000 and got in trade a Brigham Young letter from Brent Ashworth. And Ashworth was, Ashworth ended up being one of the targets, and we'll talk about him soon, but, Ashworth was one of the main dealers in Hofmann documents, and he kind of became the butt of a lot of Hofmann's worst deals. But like I said, we'll talk about that soon. So on December 12th, this is still 1984, Mike Hansen again leaves a Mark Hofmann fingerprint, which police later find on a receipt at the Salt Lake Stamp Company. Now that's important because if you remember back to episode 1 of this Mark Hofmann deconstruction, in 1980, I believe it was, he was arrested for stealing a pack of almonds, I believe it was. And at that time, he was arrested, and he was given a criminal record, and they took his fingerprints. So back in, once we get to December 12th, 1984, 4.5 years after that, Mike Hansen, a man that was, Mark Hofmann's alias, left a fingerprint that matches Mark Hofmann on a receipt. So that's a problem. That's where it starts to come back to bite him. Something that he did earlier bites him. So going on to 1985. Now this is an important year. This is when a lot of things really go down in Hofmann's world. So January 2nd, 1985, Hofmann sells 2 Jim Bridger notes to Charles Hamilton for $10,000. He'd ordered those, a mere month and a half before, and he turned around and sold them for $10,000. I mean, it's just amazing. He was wheeling and dealing in so many legitimate and forged documents. It's hard to understand the scope of exactly how many deals he was cutting around town. So on February 15th, 1985, Steve Christensen, the owner of the Salamander letter, receives a report from a man named Albert Leiter III, who was a forensic chemist in North Carolina. Now, Leiter examined the ink on the 1830 Harris letter and reported that there is no evidence that the examined document was prepared at a time other than during the time stated. So that was another person, and not a Mormon historian or anybody, an actual forensic chemist whose job it is to determine documents like this as being forgeries and whatnot. This Albert Leiter guy examined the Salamander letter and said, there's nothing that makes it look like a forgery. So there's one more point that the Salamander letter was passing, tests that it was going through. It was going through the gamut of these things and still passing. So back on to February 26th, 1985, Christensen again writes to President Hinckley about the Martin Harris letter, about his apprehension to publish it. And on the 29th, President Hinckley calls Steve Christensen and assures him that the church still wants the Harris letter. Now, why this is relevant is because even through most of 1985, the church was working on reconciling the Salamander letter with their own narrative, right? They fully believed that the letter was real. Hofmann's work kept passing test after test after test, not showing any apparent signs of being a forgery. Christensen and Hinckley continued to exchange letters and discussions about the church accepting the letter as a donation. That was the sticking point here. Now, from everything that I've seen, and given the amount of time, it seems like Hinckley was somewhat apprehensive to accept the letter as church property, accept the donation from Christensen. Now, think about it here. If the church owned up to having the letter in their possession, it could be perceived as a concession to the legitimacy of the letter, much like them buying the Joseph Smith III blessing and trading it to the RLDS Church. Simple as that. People would expect the church to publish books and pamphlets and talk about General Conference about the letter and, reconciling it somehow with the historical narrative. The Salamander letter was a challenging point in Mormon history, and the church was up in arms about what to do with it. But as long as Stephen Christensen had the letter in his actual possession, the church had some plausible deniability. It was well known that Christensen, he was a bishop of the church, owned the letter. That was publicized in, early 1984. But until the church accepted the donation of the letter, they weren't expected to publish work about their own history surrounding that letter. It bought them time. That's what they were doing here, in my opinion. But their actions show that they were merely controlling damage at this time. They didn't know how to deal with the public outcry rising from this revelation. The church leadership was stuck, thanks to a situation that Hofmann had orchestrated with publicizing the existence of the Salamander letter. It's just amazing. So Hofmann, however, just continued working. He set his sights on the ultimate prize. If you remember back to the Sandra Tanner interview from part 1, you'll recall that we briefly discussed the oath of a freeman. I was only slightly familiar with it during the discussion, and the history surrounding the oath doesn't, really pertain to our discussion today. So I'm just going to read the 4-sentence Wikipedia page about it, which gives us, some relative sense of how rare the oath of a freeman is. Now, it's Wikipedia, take it for what it is, but it says, quote, "The oath of a freeman is a loyalty oath drawn up in the early 17th century to be taken by freemen of the Plymouth colony in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. A freeman was any established member of a colony who was not under legal restraint. The oath was a vow to defend the Commonwealth and not to conspire to overthrow the government. It was first written in 1631 and revised in 1634. Original copies survive only in a handwritten copy from 1634 and in a later printed version from 1647. Stephen Day made a broadside printing of the document in 1639, but it is now lost." End quote. So for more reading, check the show notes. You'll find a link to teachingamericanhistory.org that's talking about the oath of a freeman with, the full text of it intact. But needless to say, the oath of a freeman is one of the most elusive and revered documents in all American history. An original copy of the oath would be truly invaluable because there's no market to compare them to. One of these originals has never been bought or sold before because we don't know of any that exist. This Oath of a Freeman would be Hofmann's magnum opus if he could pull it off. Now, this is his timeline going into the spring of 1985. Now, on March 8th, 1985, Mike Hansen, where's that alias for Hofmann again, orders plate from Debuzek Engraving in Salt Lake City for the Oath of a Freeman. Now, this is when it happens. March 8th, he got the plate for creating the Oath of a Freeman forgery here. And then on March 11th, 1985, Hofmann flew to New York City. And on the 13th, 2 days after that, he purchased 5 items from Argosy Bookstore in New York City for $51.42. One item he claimed he purchased at this time was the Oath of a Freeman. The oldest printed item in American history. Hofmann claimed he paid $25 for this specific item. Several days later, he returns with the Oath of a Freeman to Schiller's Gallery in New York City. So that was a 2-day turnaround. On March 8th, he received the plate for printing the Oath of a Freeman. And then March 11th, he had the forgery in his hand and he flew out to New York City and tried to establish where he received this from. So that's where he went to Argosy Bookstore and purchased these 5 items, and one of them he claimed was this Oath of a Freeman that was in his hands. It's remarkable. He was actually trying to set up a pedigree for this document here. So after that, several days later, he goes to Schiller's Gallery in New York City. This is who would be dealing with the Oath of a Freeman, Schiller's Gallery. Various authorities are contacted by Schiller to examine the document. William Matheson, who's chief of Rare Books and Special Collections Division in the Library of Congress, accepts the item, the Oath of a Freeman, and says that a battery of tests would be performed on it to determine its authenticity. In April, the Library of Congress tells Schiller and Wapner, Hofmann's agents, that it wants to buy the Oath of a Freeman. So that was just remarkable, right? It took 2 days for Hofmann to manufacture the Oath of a Freeman. He flew out to New York. He said that I bought this piece of paper from the Argosy Bookstore. They must not have known what it was. And he goes to the Schiller's Gallery and shows them this Oath of a Freeman. And Schiller's Gallery contacts a bunch of people that are in, relevant fields, and, this William Matheson of the Library of Congress. And William Matheson says, well, it's pretty remarkable. We need to do a battery of tests on it. And they call him back a month later and say, we want to buy the Oath of a Freeman. It must have passed all of their tests. Not only did Mark Hofmann fool the leaders of the church, he fooled the Library of Congress. He fooled everybody. Nobody was I can't get this through enough. I can't talk about this enough. It wasn't just gullible people that Hofmann was fooling. He was fooling everybody. So few people were claiming that he might be a forger at this point in early 1985 that nobody was questioning him. He would just come up with a document, or, somebody would come up with a document that he had sold to him and say, I found this and it's really cool. And people would just say, that is remarkable. I want to buy it for a ton of money. And he just flew on this. He just created a reputation and flew on his own reputation for so long. It was amazing. But it has to be said, he was creating forgeries that were the next level of quality. They were so amazing. They were passing tests that no other forgeries had passed up to this point. It's just crazy to think about this. He was able to get the Library of Congress to basically say they want to buy the Oath of a Freeman. They didn't know if it was real, but the only reason they had to suspect that it was a forgery was the rarity of the document. There are no known copies of the Oath of a Freeman from the original 1631 production, and that's what Hofmann was claiming this was. So the only reason they had to suspect it was a forgery was because they had never seen one before. So Hofmann was just established as a legitimate document trader, and this only seemed like his next big find. So the oath underwent the battery of tests, and it didn't show a single sign of forgery whatsoever. So back into March 15th of 85, Thomas Wilding and associate Sid Jensen at Hofmann's invitation agreed to invest $22,500 in 18 rare books. None of these were forgeries. These were actual legitimate rare books that Hofmann had his eye on, he wanted to get. On March 20th, Kenneth Rendell, there's Rendell again, sent his final report to Christensen saying there's no indication that the Harris 1830 letter is a forgery. Nobody could find anything wrong with it. It appeared at all levels to be a completely legitimate document. Then on March 21st, Wilding and Company investors gave Hofmann $22,500 to actually purchase the rare books. It took, less than a week for that deal to actually go through. But we have to talk about this for a second. Why was Hofmann buying these rare books? Because they're fascinating, right? He had a fascination with rare books. From a very young age, obviously. He loved old documents like this, antique stuff. But we also need to point out that that was the source for a lot of his paper. When you open up an old book, or just any book, you open it up, there's a blank page, and then the title page after that, and then a few blank pages, and then the copyright page, blank page, table of contents, so on and so forth. Those blank pages come in a lot of handy when you're manufacturing old documents that come from the same time that these books were printed. So, you buy 18 rare books, you suddenly have, 3 or 4 or 5 pages of old paper out of each of those rare books that you can take and you can turn into something else. So that's one reason why Hofmann bought so many rare books. And also, I do need to say he kind of had a fixation with old children's books too. It might have had something to do with using the paper out of them, but he was also amassing a small collection of first edition children's books from the 17 and 1800s, old first edition children's books as a gift for his wife and his children. They were later seized after he was convicted, so, I guess it didn't really pan out as a gift, but still, he was collecting a lot of rare books. He loved this. He had a fascination with them. So back onto the timeline here. March 25th, Mike Hansen, once again the alias for Mark Hofmann, ordered a second plate of the Oath of a Freeman. Remarkably, he didn't just find one copy of the Oath of a Freeman, he found 2 copies. Amazing, isn't it? So back on to April 3rd, Christensen tells the Salt Lake Tribune that tests show the Harris letter to be authentic. Researchers are preparing it for publication, and that their findings will be announced at the Mormon History Association annual meetings in May. So while Hofmann is off in New York dealing with the Oath of a Freeman and, making another copy of it and working on this collection of 18 rare books for $22,500, the church and people, scholars and historians were still trying to authenticate or, disprove the Salamander letter. Like, there was still so much going on, and he was still amassing a backlog of other forgeries that people were still needing to examine, that they just had no reason to believe that they were forgeries. So on to April 8th of 1985, Schiller sends the Oath of a Freeman to the Library of Congress. Now Schiller, like I said, was the place that Hofmann was using as his, his liaison to the Library of Congress in New York City. And they asked $1.5 million for the Oath of a Freeman. So after the Library of Congress went through the battery of tests and said, we can't conclude that it's a forgery, we want to buy it, Schiller sent the Oath of a Freeman back to him and said, well, if you want to buy it, it's going to cost you $1.5 million. That's over $3 million today. That's crazy. So April 16th, 1985 comes along. There's a letter of David and Peter Whitmer to Bithell Todd that was dated August 12th, 1828, that was sold to the church for $1,500 by Hofmann. So in no way was he done making forgeries of old Mormon documents. He was still manufacturing these things. This letter from David and Peter Whitmer to Bithell Todd, complete forgery, sold it for, just $1,500 to the church. Just these little small scores that were keeping him afloat, keeping his head above water. So it's just remarkable how fast he was able to crank these things out. So on to April 18th, this is a monumental day in the Hofmann timeline. April 18th, 1985, the First Presidency accepts Stephen Christensen's donation of the Harris 1830 letter to the church. Finally, it took him from when the letter was actually sold to Christensen at the end of 1983, a year and a half later, the middle of April 1985, the First Presidency finally said, okay, we're going to accept your donation of this letter and all of the responsibility that comes along with that. So at this point, it almost became official that Hofmann could get away with anything. The church finally accepted this letter as a donation from Christensen, and Gary Sheets is in there too. Don't ever forget Gary Sheets. It always says Stephen Christensen, but Gary Sheets is along with it too. And they're basically symbolically accepting it as a legitimate historical document if they're accepting it as a donation. Regardless of what happened after this, I think Hofmann just won in his own way. He got the church to accept something that he manufactured in his basement as a historical fact. If we try and apply motives to Hofmann's actions, it seems like this is exactly what he wanted all along. He'd been doing it for like 6 years before this, but the church accepting something as absurd and damaging to their own history as the White Salamander letter must have been a milestone. If we're positing motivations here, I think that Hofmann had won in his own mind. But the rest of the world didn't know that he had won. And unfortunately, people like Hofmann, or anybody, they rarely quit while they're winning. It takes a massive loss in order to hang up the gloves and to walk away from the game. So on to April 23rd, Alvin Rust gives Hofmann money, $150,000 worth of money to purchase the McClellan collection in New York City. Now, this is important. This serves to be what takes Hofmann down, the McClellan collection. Hofmann told Rust that he had sold the McClellan collection to the LDS Church for $300,000. He just needed $150,000 to take to New York City with him to go buy the collection. So that is a point that this is like our first big red flag that comes up in Hofmann's timeline. April 23rd, 1985. That's when the McClellan collection enters the realm of Hofmann's business deals. So on to the 28th of April, the Church News, which is, the Deseret News, but the Church News section announces the church's acquisition of the Harris letter from Christensen, and they published the letter along with a careful statement from the First Presidency acknowledging its apparent authenticity. So that's what the church was waiting for. They were trying to buy time. And finally, once they accepted the donation, they came out in the Church News section of the Deseret News and said, okay, we have the letter. This is what it says. Yes, it seems to be authentic. We can't really find anything that shows it's a forgery. And that was something hard for the church to do. So on the 29th of April, the Utah Lighthouse Ministries Salt Lake Messenger, that's their own newspaper, the UTLM's newspaper, accused the LDS Church of hiding a second letter that deals with early treasure hunting by the Smith family. Now, that's what we're talking about with the letter that was tacked onto the Salamander letter was the letter between Smith and Stowell in 1825 that Hofmann forged, and Gary Sheets had to be brought back into the Salamander letter to deal with the extra $15,000 that this 1825 letter would fetch. So the Salt Lake Tribune claimed that this 1825 Smith and Stowell letter exists, but a church spokesman denies that the church possesses it. But Hofmann and many people knew that in addition to the Salamander letter, that 1825 letter was tacked onto the deal. So they knew that the church had that letter as well, and they wanted them to own up to it. So on April 30th, Rhett James questions the authenticity of the Harris letter based on a study of word patterns of known Harris writings. So what happened is, Gerald Tanner published in, late 1984, August 1984, that this doesn't sound, the Salamander letter doesn't sound anything like what we would expect from Martin Harris. Then Rhett James went through and examined other letters from Martin Harris that we know to be actual letters from, like 1848, 1863, stuff like that. And he examined the word pattern usage and, common phrases that are in those, and he was able to find correlation between the previous letters. But then he examined that same word pattern usage to the Salamander letter and said, yeah, that doesn't sound anything like Harris. So what Gerald Tanner had said about the Harris letter, the Salamander letter sounding nothing like Harris, Rhett James was like, yeah, this also does not. I agree, this doesn't sound anything like Harris. So now the questions of authenticity about the Salamander letter are really starting to, build up. People are starting to question it a little bit more than they were before. And of course, it just took the church actually publishing that in their own, Deseret News for that to actually be publicized. But on May 2nd, that's when the Mormon History Association annual meeting in Independence, Missouri, they had their meeting about it. Dean Jesse summarized his findings by experts who noted that nothing had been found indicating a forgery. That's what we read from earlier, and as Jesse would re-emphasize in the months to follow, one can prove forgery, but not authenticity, and authenticating is a matter of reducing probability, not of proving. So that's what we read from earlier, those 5 criteria that we read through that discussed what we would expect from the Salamander letter and what we would expect from anything written in 1830. The Salamander letter comports exactly with what we would expect. And that's Dean Jesse's writing. But of course, Ronald Walker discusses the context of treasure hunting into which the letter apparently fits, because this is the Mormon History Association. It's where a bunch of Mormons gather together and discuss Mormon history. So what else are they going to talk about other than the Salamander letter that seems to be, fairly historically accurate at the time? So, the church was accepting this. Dean Jesse had published his treatise on it, saying, yeah, it seems legitimate. There's nothing that proves that it's a forgery. And Ronald Walker was the Mormon apologist who said, this doesn't come into conflict with our narrative or how we understand Mormon history. It's just what they did back then, basically. So, yeah, it's messy. It's very, very messy. Things get a little confusing here as more people get involved and Hofmann continues to set up more and more deals with more and more documents and forgeries that he was making. The McClellan collection, like I said, unfortunately marks the fall of Mark Hofmann, and mid-April 1985 is when this harbinger rises to signal the collapse of Hofmann's business model. Now, Hofmann claimed that he had the McClellan collection, which is a box of journals and letters that prove Joseph Smith to be a fraud, apparently, the likes of which the Salamander letter never thought possible. Now, a little background here. William McClellan was a prominent member of the church during the early years from 1831 until the 1838 defection crisis that happened. He was also a school teacher and basically a historian who was considered to be one of the best contemporary historians to Joseph Smith that we have available to us. Very, very prolific writer. So Hofmann claimed that the McClellan collection was embarrassing to the church and to Joseph Smith, thus generating a lot of public excitement about this. A lot of people wanted to see the McClellan collection, especially because it was supposed to be like there's a huge box of a bunch of journals and clippings, writings from McClellan. I mean, not just a couple of letters or something, but, an entire box of like 36 journals here. So it was no small feat to try and manufacture the McClellan collection. But Hofmann, to put some perspective on it, Hofmann had sold the Salamander letter as damaging and embarrassing to Mormon history, and he delivered on that promise, right? It was very challenging for Mormon apologists to reconcile the Salamander letter with Mormon authenticity. So anybody that heard of the McClellan collection from Hofmann knew that when he said he had something good, he wouldn't disappoint. The McClellan collection would be just as embarrassing to Mormon history as Hofmann claimed it was. So in April, Hofmann borrowed this money from Alvin Rust, this $150,000, to get a hold of the McClellan collection, only to tell him that, he'd sold it to the LDS Church for double the money that Rust had invested. He hadn't even bought the McClellan collection at that time. Now, I'm assuming that meant Rust would get repaid as soon as the church went through with the deal, right? And he'd make money back on its investment. At this point, I think Rust was the only person that knew about the McClellan collection from the mouth of Hofmann. A man named Hugh Pinnock would later be the second person that Hofmann made a promise of the McClellan collection to, and we'll get to that in a minute here. But it really seems to show signs of desperation on Hoffman's part when he takes money from 2 people, claiming he can come up with the McClellan collection and sell it to the church with huge returns on their investments, with no real plan to actually produce that collection or make the deal happen. That was the problem. All the while Hofmann was working out the logistics of the McClellan collection, people were still questioning his Salamander letter. Even Dean Jesse was saying that all of their studies can't prove authenticity, just rule out the possibility of forgery, something that doesn't translate to newspaper headlines very well. I went over that last episode. To make the church look even worse during this time, Hofmann had sold Christensen and Sheets the 1825 Smith and Stowell letter that we talked about earlier, and anonymously leaked to the Salt Lake Tribune that the church has the letter and is hiding it. Now, this is a challenging point, because earlier there was a church spokesman that said, "We don't know what you're talking about." But then on May 5th, just a couple of weeks after the spokesman said that, the same church spokesman comes out and retracts his denial of the church having the letter, saying that he was informed by President Hinckley that the letter was in the first presidency vault, and perhaps it would be subject of critical study as the Harris letter had been. So the Tanners came out and said, "We know that you're hiding this letter." Then Hofmann went and leaked to the Salt Lake Tribune, "The church has this 1825 Smith and Stowell letter." He knew, of course. Hofmann knew. He wrote the letter. He made it. He was the one who made the deal with Stephen Christensen and Gary Sheets to sell them the Salamander letter and the 1825 Smith Stowell letter. So the church comes out 2 weeks later and was like, "Yeah, we're going to just pull back on that denial. Turns out President Hinckley actually had this letter in his vault. He didn't tell me about it. Sorry about that." The leadership was looking a little bit foolish at this point. So it took a mere 4 days, and on May 9th, the first presidency released the text of the 1825 letter. And Dean Jesse said that the document appears definitely to be in the hand of Joseph Smith. Now, Dean Jesse was a Joseph Smith scholar, so if he puts his stamp of approval on it, that's pretty important. And being a letter in 1825, this is the earliest known document written by the prophet. That's rough, right? And then, of course, after that, document expert Charles Hamilton of New York had authenticated the letter earlier. So not only was Dean Jesse a Joseph Smith expert saying that this 1825 letter is legit, Charles Hamilton, a non-Mormon document expert back in New York, said, "Yeah, the letter was pretty legitimate." So yeah, it was so confusing. It was so challenging to the church. They didn't know what to do with this. So on May 11th, 2 days later, newspapers nationwide featured headlines claiming that the Smith and Stowell 1825 letter links the Mormon church founder to the occult, just like the Salamander letter had done before. Like I said last episode, it's so clear that Hofmann knew just what screws to turn and how hard to turn them. That's what we're really seeing happen here. The pressure was getting turned up everywhere. It's so exciting. So on May 14th of 85, a spokesman denies that the church has a hidden Oliver Cowdery history. It was leaked to the newspapers that they had this Oliver Cowdery history and that the church is hiding it. And of course, a spokesman had to come out and say, "No, we don't know what you're talking about." So on May 15th, Walter McCrow Associates find that the Harris letter, the Salamander letter paper, was consistent with paper that was used at that time. So, the Salamander letter was still under scrutiny. In May of 85, people were still studying the Salamander letter. And, Walter McCrow Associates were like, "Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what we'd expect with paper that was, made back then and people used for letters back then. So, yeah, it seems pretty legit." So, I mean, all of these things were going on. The Salamander letter was still going through multiple batteries of tests here. People were trying to determine if it was a forgery. And all this while, Hofmann was still down in his basement cranking out forgery after forgery and selling them for crazy amounts of money. And then finally, on May 20th, Time magazine did an expose, and they published an article called "Challenging Mormonism's Roots" about the documents controversy that was happening. Now, I'm going to read an extract from that Time article. I can't read the whole thing because I don't subscribe to the magazine, and the entire article is behind a paywall. But if you want to read all of it, just follow the link in the show notes, and you can read the entire thing. It's called "Challenging Mormonism's Roots" by Time magazine. Quote, "It's an incredible crisis of faith for me," says Mormon Klaus Hansen, who teaches at Queen's University in Ontario. "It means our historical foundation becomes a nice story that has no connection to reality. To Denise Olson, a law student and mother of 3 in Bountiful, Utah, hey, my hometown, it's another evidence to me that things have gone awry in the church. A devout Mormon couple in Whittier, California, In a letter to friends explaining why they have left the church, say new revelations about the Mormons' founding prophet have destroyed their beliefs. End quote. That's the only excerpt that I can get from the Time article. I'm sure the rest of it is just as unflattering and indicative of how well the church was handling these Hofmann documents surfacing. Hofmann's documents were gaining national attention. News outlets, prominent news outlets everywhere were covering these documents and the church's responses to the documents and joining in the public voice that was pressuring church leadership to publish these challenging documents. This must have been exactly what Hofmann had wanted all along. There's no way of knowing that for sure, but if this is what he was trying to do, make the leadership look foolish, he was succeeding remarkably well. Now, there's so much more to go through. We got to burn through this timeline here to get to the good parts today. So I'm just going to hit on some of the highlights of the next few months leading up to October of 1985. So on May 20th, Kenneth Rendell, there's that guy again, Kenneth Rendell verifies, based on his examination and tests, that based on the ink and the paper tests done by others, that there's no indication that the Salamander letter is a forgery. So Kenneth Rendell does another test on the ink and the paper of the Salamander letter and says, yeah, totally legit. Then 5 days later, May 25th, a guy named Ronald Vern Jackson displays a forgery of the Neely court document to claim that the Harris letter is a fake. Now, I don't know the details of this. I don't know exactly what happened. But this just shows that there was a growing body of people that were saying the Harris letter doesn't sound very legit. I mean, there's Gerald Tanner kind of at the beginning, but he just kind of sparked it. Everybody after that, a lot of people started picking up on this and said, yeah, this doesn't sound good. This, I kind of have a problem with this. So Brent Metcalf, who we talked about earlier, was fired by Stephen Christensen. He was one of Christensen's employees after this. After he was fired, he went to work for Hofmann. He had passed on to John Dart, who was a reporter of the LA Times, information from an anonymous source, who was actually Hofmann, about the existence of the Oliver Cowdery history that was hidden by the first presidency. So that was what happened. Hofmann had leaked through Brent Metcalf that the church has an Oliver Cowdery history that they're trying to suppress. They're trying to hide it. And then Brent Metcalf went and talked to John Dart, who was a reporter for the LA Times, and said, hey, the church has this Oliver Cowdery history that they're trying to hide, just like they did the 1825 Smith and Stowell letter, just like they did the Salamander letter, just like they have a bunch of other documents. So finally, in early June of 1985, Brent Metcalf, John Dart, and Mark Hofmann all sit down and meet. And Hofmann told Dart that he has actually seen the Oliver Cowdery history in the vault of the First Presidency, and that this history contains a different account of the origins of the church, and that it credited Alvin Smith with a key role in obtaining the Book of Mormon plates. Whether this Oliver Cowdery history exists or not, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But Hofmann claiming that the church is hiding this Oliver Cowdery history, I think almost speaks more to the credibility that it actually exists. Every leak that Hofmann had done up to this point, whether it was a Salamander letter, the 1825 letter, whatever it was, those documents actually existed and the church had a hold of them. Why would he claim that the church is hiding something that they don't have in their possession? I mean, it was probably a Hofmann forgery regardless, but we've never seen this Oliver Cowdery history that they're talking about here. As far as we know, it doesn't exist. The church probably just has it locked away in their vault. So moving on to June of 85 here. This is when Wilford Cardin wires $110,000 to Schiller and Wagner in New York City to invest in a Charles Dickens manuscript, The Haunted Man and the Ghost Bargain. Hofmann had told him of the investment opportunity. So Hofmann came to him and said, hey, if you wire $110,000 to Schiller Wagner in New York City, they have this Charles Dickens manuscript. So what Hofmann was going to do is come up with this manuscript, forge it, and then go sell it to Schiller Wagner, and then Schiller Wagner was going to sell it to Wilford Cardin. Hofmann offers this same investment opportunity 4 days later to Thomas Wilding. So he had two people competing for this manuscript, so hopefully he would be able to get the money out of it, one or possibly both of them. Who knows what his plan was here. So on June 13th, the Los Angeles Times cites an insider That's an anonymous interview with Mark Hofmann, that the LDS Church presidency is hiding an Oliver Cowdery history. That was what happened with the meeting with John Dart, Brent Metcalf, and Mark Hofmann. They had discussed this Oliver Cowdery history, and that's on June 13th. They actually published the article saying the LDS Church is hiding this history along with who knows what other documents. So, this is going on with the church, and then the next day after that, June 14th, the Library of Congress returns the Oath of a Freeman to Schiller and Wapner, claiming that the price at $1.5 million is too high. So that $1.5 million that Hofmann was really banking on, really hoping for, expecting out of the Oath of a Freeman, it was gone. It collapsed. He was expecting that. He needed that $1.5 million to repay a lot of debts and to make a lot of deals happen, and it's gone. This threw a huge wrench in Hofmann's deals. He had the pressure of the McClellan collection building up at this point, and this $1.5 million from the Library of Congress would have been great. It would have helped out so much. But suddenly the floor was ripped out from under Hofmann in the middle of this deal, and suddenly $1.5 million he thought he was going to have is just gone. It just evaporated. Huge problem in Hofmann's deals. So on the 28th of June, Elder Hugh Pinnock helps to arrange a loan of $185,000 from First Interstate Bank for Hofmann to help purchase the McClellan papers. So Hofmann earlier had taken $150,000 from a guy to buy the McClellan papers, and now a few months later, here we are, he took another $185,000 from Hugh Pinnock and said, hey, I'm going to buy the McClellan papers with this money. It's starting to get really shifty at this point, isn't it? As soon as Hofmann starts claiming, hey, I know how to double your investment. If you give me $150,000 or $185,000, I can double your investment with this McClellan papers. That's a big problem because he didn't have the McClellan papers. He didn't have any way of selling them or buying them because they weren't in his possession. They weren't in anybody's possession that anybody knew about at this time. It later we found out that the church actually had it in their vault, and maybe there was something going on behind the scenes that isn't, readily apparent at the moment. But still, the McClellan collection was the harbinger that I talked about earlier. This was what signaled the fall of Hofmann. And on July 6th, the Salt Lake Tribune, citing Hofmann, says that the McClellan collection includes facsimile number 2 from the Pearl of Great Price. So, what Hofmann did is said, hey, the McClellan collection has facsimile number 2. And if I can create facsimile number 2 and produce it, that will show people that I have the McClellan collection. It will, reinstill good faith in these people that are questioning my ability to deliver on my forgeries or on my work, right? So on July 29th, something else happens that really signals things are starting to collapse around Hofmann. There was a letter of Joseph Smith to General Jonathan Dunham that was written on June 27th, 1844. That was the day that Joseph Smith died. That's a pretty important letter right there. But that letter was sold to Brent Ashworth after Hofmann had bought it from Deseret Book Company, which had bought it from Dr. Richard Marks, who had bought it from Hofmann. So what happened was Brent Ashworth was starting to think that Hofmann isn't as trustworthy as he claims to be. Maybe we should start questioning these documents. And he started telling people about that. And that was a big problem for Hofmann. So what Hofmann did was, originally this letter from Joseph Smith to General Jonathan Dunham, he originally had sold it to Richard Marks, who sold it to Deseret Book Company. Then Brent Ashworth bought it too, and saying, this is an amazing document. Who knows what the dollar amount on this exactly is. But then Brent Ashworth was like, I don't know if this is legitimate. And Hofmann is starting to seem not that trustworthy. So Hofmann bought that letter back from Brent Ashworth, having been the person who originally manufactured the document. So what happened, basically, Hofmann had to buy his own forgery to pay off somebody from spilling the beans that he is not trustworthy, that he's forging these documents. And he lost $56,000 on this transaction. This is really starting to show, the walls are crumbling around Hofmann here. Things are not quite as hunky-dory as he was hoping for. So in August of 1985, there are the Brigham Young papers were sold to the Wilding Group for $23,600. These will come into play later, but these were legitimate. The Brigham Young papers were actual legitimate documents. They weren't forgeries by Hofmann, so they'll come into play later. But on August 12th of 85, Hofmann makes a bad decision. He got to a point where his lifestyle really started getting too lavish for his income level. His wife, Dory Olds, said later on that it was either feast or famine for us on a month-to-month basis. Hofmann was terrible with his money. Whenever it was a good month for us, I'd go out and buy 3 months worth of groceries just so we would be able to eat during the famine times. So during this time where Hofmann was losing a little bit of money, on August 12th, he went out and signed a contract to buy a home in the Cottonwood area of Salt Lake City for $550,000. That's like a $1.2 million home today. And if you know Salt Lake City, the Cottonwood area are where some really, really nice homes are. So the terms of this contract are challenging. And I don't know why he didn't just do a normal mortgage like a normal person, possibly because he was expecting to make a whole bunch of money from the McClellan collection or from the Oath of a Freeman or whatever the case may be. What happened was Hofmann agreed to pay $5,000 in earnest money, and then $195,000 at closure, and 3 additional annual installments of $195,000 again. The closing date was set for October 15th. October 15th. That's an important date at 1 p.m. Very important to keep that date in mind, October 15th. So on August 12th, 2 months before this, he had agreed to buy this huge home in the Cottonwood area. Probably today would fetch, well over $1 million. This is a really, really nice home. And the points of the contract were very, tough to meet if you're somebody that's your entire income is based on the manufacturing of false documents. So to move on in the timeline, on August 21st through 24th, 1985, that was the next year's Sunstone Symposium. If we remember back 1 year before this, 1984, that was when Gerald and Sandra Tanner published their money-digging papers, where they challenged the legitimacy of the Salamander letter. Well, a year later, D. Michael Quinn, Marvin Hill, and Ronald Walker say that Joseph Smith's involvement with folk magic can be sustained without the Hofmann documents. And the Tanners have been claiming this for decades at this point. I mean, that was really no secret among a lot of Mormon historians. But people that were new to Mormon history, they're like, what? Joseph Smith, folk magic? What are you talking about? And then, of course, just a couple years after this, D. Michael Quinn would publish the Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. And that eventually led to his excommunication in 1993 as part of the September 6th. But that's another topic to talk about on a later day. But on September 3rd, just, a week and a half after the Sunstone Symposium in Salt Lake City, Hofmann wrote a check for $185,000 to First Interstate Bank. Now, originally, he took this money so he could go off and buy the McClellan collection. Well, he didn't end up getting a hold of the McClellan collection, so he attempted to repay the First Interstate Bank, and the check bounced. Indicative of some very serious money problems. So at this point, it seems like Hofmann might be a little bit desperate. He's $185,000 in debt to First Interstate Bank. He doesn't have the ability to make good on a check to pay him back. And the only reason that he initially got that check was so that he could cash it and go spend the money on other very, very important things. One of which was earnest money for a monstrous house in Cottonwood Heights area of Salt Lake City. So what happened a week after this, on September 10th, Deseret Books sold a Book of Common Prayer to Hofmann for $50. And amazingly enough, this was a collector book because it contained a signature of Nathan Harris in the back of it. Several days after that, Hofmann returned to Deseret Book and claimed that there was a poem written by Martin Harris in the back of the book. Like, what? An entire poem by Martin Harris? He didn't seem intelligent enough to prose something together like that. But that, it's like he bought something and said, I need some money fast. I really, really need some cash. So I'm going to just make up this forgery of a Martin Harris poem and hope that Deseret Book wants to buy it back or somebody wants to buy it from me. So on September 13th, things, I don't know how else to say this, but things really begin to collapse. September 13th, I think marks, it's a month before things really, really go, very poorly for Hofmann. And this seems like kind of the signal of it, because on September 13th, Hofmann admits to Wilding and Sid Jensen. Wilding was the guy that loaned him $185,000 to go buy the McClellan collection. And Sid Jensen, a person that came up earlier, that their money had not purchased the Oath of a Freeman or the Dickens manuscript or the Brigham Young papers and the McClellan collection. And the offers didn't exist anymore. He couldn't return their money. The offer was off of the table. He couldn't make good on the deal. He couldn't deliver on what they had already paid him. And then Hofmann spends the rest of the day trying to raise money. This was an admission of failure on Hofmann's part. This was a big problem. He came to these investors and said, I don't have your money. Not only that, I don't have the thing that you gave me the money for, and I don't have any way of making good on that. Those offers are no longer on the table. Those things don't exist. I'm sorry. One investor on that day, it doesn't say who, actually hit Hofmann in the face on September 13th. And that really, I think that was indicative on the pressure that was building on Hofmann to make good on some of these deals. More and more of the deals were slipping away. He was incapable of turning out things that he was claiming he had, or he was incapable of making deals actually happen now. And things were slipping away from him, and all he could do was admit failure at these points. So on September 16th, Leslie Kress and Kenneth Rendell, there's Kenneth Rendell, there's that name again, sell Hofmann 2 pieces of papyrus, Egyptian papyrus, on consignment for an expected $10,500 sale. That's important. Keep that in mind. Leslie Kress and Kenneth Rendell sold Hofmann papyrus, ancient 1st century Egyptian papyrus. On the 23rd of September, barely more than a week later, Hofmann offers to sell a papyrus piece to Kurt Bench of Deseret Book Company. Now, Kurt Bench, if you recognize that name, he's actually the owner of Benchmark Books, a rare book dealer in Salt Lake City. I've been told by more than one person that I need to check out Benchmark Books. I have yet to do it, but apparently it's a great place for Mormon history and for, rare book collections where you can buy and sell stuff. But to go on 2 days later, September 25th, Hofmann offered to sell a piece of papyrus to Brent Ashworth. So he gets these papyrus from Kenneth Rendell and Leslie Kress and says, hey, I can sell these for $10,000. Consign them to me. When I sell them, I'll pay you back for them. So he offered to sell it to Kurt Bench. Bench says no. He offered to sell it to Ashworth. Ashworth said no. He tries to use the papyrus as collateral for a $150,000 loan by Wade Lillywhite of Deseret Book, and he says no. This papyrus that he took for $10,000 on consignment, it's not exactly panning out like he had hoped it would. He was trying to take it, get it on consignment, turn it around, sell it for some quick cash to pay off some of his debts at the moment. Nothing was panning out after this. Into October 1st. This is important. October is our big month here. October 1st, Hofmann sold some Deseret currency notes to Deseret Book. It doesn't list a dollar amount there, but probably a fair amount of money because he had sold the previous collection for like $36,000 or something absurd like that. So probably a fair amount of money there, but that was just something he had manufactured. Deseret currency notes, he had just printed those up in his basement. On October 2nd, Christensen warns Hofmann to tell Pinnock of his problems. So Stephen Christensen, at this point, it's pretty well accepted that Christensen knew Hofmann was a fraud. October 2nd came along. Christensen says, dude, Hofmann, get out of the game. You are under too much pressure. Too many people want too much from you. If you keep at the rate you're going, you're going to end up dead. So tell Pinnock what's going on. And Hofmann says, I can't do it. So the next day, October 3rd, Hofmann sold that book of Common Prayer that he bought from Deseret Book with the Nathan Harris signature. He, wrote that Martin Harris poem in the back of it, and he went and turned around and sold that book for $700 in trade. So he doesn't even get liquid cash that he could pay off debts. He just, got a document or got something that was worth $700 for it. He's just piddling away these tiny deals. He wasn't able to make good on this McClellan collection that was supposedly worth $300,000, or the Oath of a Freeman that was worth $1.5 million. He's reduced to collecting $700 on writing, on a poem, a forged poem that probably took him, a day or two to actually come up with. I mean, things are really starting to slide here. It's not under as much control as everything used to be before, when, before Hofmann started making these crazier deals. So on October 4th, Hofmann actually went to Elder Hugh Pinnock, and he said that he has to sell the McClellan collection rather than donate it to the church. That was the hopes, that he would donate it to the church. The church would give him back $300,000 in trade. So Pinnock arranged for it to be purchased for $185,000. That was hopefully, once Hofmann picked up the McClellan collection and sold it, he'd get that $185,000. He could sell it to somebody else or pay off some other debts, because he had a lot going on. There's a lot of money going out of his pockets and hardly anything coming in at this moment. So during October 13th through the 19th, Mission President David E. Sorensen, working through his attorney named David West, decided he should purchase the McClellan collection if someone can authenticate it. And Stephen Christensen was chosen to do this. So, Christensen told Hofmann, get out of the game. You can't come up with the McClellan collection. It's just too much for you. Then David Sorensen said, I will buy the McClellan collection for a lot of money, but somebody has to authenticate it. Steve Christensen, will you authenticate it for me? And that became a problem, because Steve Christensen knew that Hofmann wasn't really trustworthy, and Hofmann didn't have the physical McClellan collection in his hands at the time. Then on October 6th, a 1/3 interest in a Betsy Ross letter was sold to Wilford Carden. It doesn't tell us a dollar amount there, but you can be sure that it wasn't worth $150,000 or something that Hofmann really, really needed. He was just able to sell 1/3 interest in it, basically. So he's basically grasping at any little dollar amount that he can grab onto, that he can use to pay some of his debts, or to acquire something else to help pay the debts. He's just incapable of producing what he needs to at this time. There's too much going on with Hofmann right now. I'm looking at this in the abstract, 30 years after it happened, and I can't keep track of any of this. It's just a blur in my mind at this point. I mean, I've been doing research on this for, about two and a half weeks now, and I can't understand the majority of it. It's just still, every time I pull up a document or a website or, a news article on it, there's so much more to learn. I can't even wrap my mind around it. It makes me wonder how Hofmann was able to do this. I mean, he was just setting up deal after deal to keep his head above water. He was in deep, deep debt. And it seemed like he was just pulling whatever deal he could to manage any small amount of money that he could possibly get to try and pay off some debt, or try and get something that he could repay it off his debts with. It was just such a convoluted mess. But, just thinking about it, maybe saying that he was doing this just to keep his head above water is kind of the wrong perspective, right? Maybe at this point it was, but earlier on, I mean, I think about this. Last episode, I said that Hofmann was approaching some of his business with like a crackhead mentality. He had sold the Salamander letter to Stephen Christensen for $40,000, but to sweeten the deal, he tacked on the 1825 Smith and Stowell letter, which added another $15,000 to the deal and, added a bit more money down. And that's when Gary Sheets entered the equation there. But remember, Hofmann set up this convoluted deal and promised to deliver on a forgery he had yet to manufacture because he had a quote-unquote cash flow problem. It seems like he was willing to make promises and do whatever necessary to keep the money flowing in, even if that meant putting himself in an uncomfortable situation. But maybe viewing it as desperation is the wrong way to view what Hofmann did. I mean, maybe at this point, it's fitting, approaching October 15th, it's fitting, but before that, I mean, Maybe there's another way to look at this. Like, take an example here. Do you have like a friend or a cousin or, some relative or like somebody in your life that's an adrenaline junkie? A lot of people know somebody like this, so just put that person in your mind for a second here. That person might grow up building ramps to like jump their bike or their skateboard off of, and or they might be somebody that like walks balance beam style across the tops of the monkey bars high above the playground at school. I mean, adrenaline junkies are never satisfied with doing something and then calling it good. They always have to raise the stakes. That kid jumping her bike off of plywood ramps at the age of 6 is jumping motorcycles and doing tricks in the air by her mid-20s. That same kid walking the tops of the monkey bars is found cooking an omelet on a high wire attached to 2 skyscrapers spanning Times Square in his mid-30s. Adrenaline junkies always need to up the ante. That's just their life's purpose. That being said, I don't think it's a stretch of imagination to say that making deals and conning people into buying forgeries was just Hofmann's thing. He was great at it, arguably the greatest at it. I would argue that he wasn't making these deals only to sustain himself or his lifestyle, but more to sustain his life's purpose. What that purpose may have been, I don't think we can really know for sure, but if we apply this adrenaline junkie mindset to Hofmann's business deals, it would make sense that he kept doing more epic deals with greater stakes whenever he had the opportunity the further he got along in his career. He was known for asking people if there was a document that they were looking for, and once they told him what they were looking for, he would say something along the lines of, well, I'll look into it and see if I can't find what you're looking for. Remarkably enough, he would emerge a few weeks or a few months later and have exactly what that person was looking for. I think Hofmann got high off of showing people his forgeries and them totally believing him, just like any other charlatan in all human history. To put a more sinister motive on it, though, if he sought to help the church and its leadership to make fools of themselves, he had done so many times by the time fall of 1985 rolled around. The public just wasn't aware of the extent of the foolishness yet. People didn't know how many documents the church was buying up for the purposes of suppressing yet. But we can't ignore the desperation at this point. Yeah, it must have had something to do with Hofmann's decisions, but maybe he was also doing it for the love of the game. His bounced checks and, promising the same deal to multiple investors to the point of being punched in the face by one of them provides us evidence that things weren't so hunky-dory in Hofmann's world and, desperate circumstances were taking their toll, but the love of the game would help explain how he got into this situation in the first place. But this is where things turn, because on October 7th of 1985, Radio Shack outlet in Cottonwood Mall in South Salt Lake sold to M. Hansen, Mike Hansen, a battery holder and a mercury switch. Things just turned. Hofmann wasn't done. Obviously he couldn't just stop. But on October 11th, Hofmann offered to sell President Hinckley a Kinderhook plate and Joseph's translation of it, but Hinckley turned him down. October 13th, Hofmann tried to sell the papyrus for $100,000 and was turned down. By now, Hofmann's personal debts are $1.3 million. This final part of the discussion is going to take us to the end of this episode. Now, I was optimistic that we could cover everything about Mark Hofmann in 2 episodes, but that's just not a reality. That's not in the cards. It needs to be pointed out that I am ignoring so many deals and so many newspaper clippings and so much for the sake of conciseness here. It would take us 4 episodes of, 9-hour-long episodes to cover every single deal Hofmann did in as much detail as we discussed the Salamander Letter deal. And each deal that he did after that was more convoluted and epically orchestrated than the last. I wish that I could just do the rest of this podcast's 10 years on Hofmann alone, because he's such a remarkable individual, and the work he did can't be examined with enough detail. And I realized something. It's weird to talk about a murderer like this. If you listened to the first episode with the Sandra Tanner interview, or you know a little bit about Mormon history, you know what happened next, and it's absolutely crazy. Some people listening to this show right now were members of the church when all of this news was breaking about these incredible Mormon document finds with the name Mark Hofmann occasionally cropping up. But what happened next was a plan. A premeditated and destructive plan. Hofmann had fallen through on multiple deals by this point. His total debts were $1.3 million. More than that, actually. He was trying to buy a house, but the first check for $195,000 had bounced, indicative of serious money problems. Now, as I said earlier, it's rumored that Steve Christensen knew that Hofmann was manufacturing documents he couldn't be trusted, but that can't really be confirmed. But we do know that a meeting was set up between Kenneth Rendell and Steve Christensen to discuss the McClellan collection. Kenneth Rendell, the guy that sold the papyrus on consignment, basically, to Hofmann. And Steve Christensen, the guy that knew Hofmann was a forger and a fraud at this point. There was going to be a deal between them talking about the McClellan collection. Now, in the McClellan collection, Hofmann claimed that facsimile number 2 of Joseph Smith's Egyptian papyri was included. The problem with this inclusion is the logistics of the forgery. Now, Hofmann could manufacture old documents with old cotton paper or pages ripped out of old books, but when it came to ancient Egyptian papyri, there wasn't really any source paper, like source papyri, that he could use and to scavenge to replicate the facsimile without buying actual ancient Egyptian papyri. So Hofmann took this first century papyri from Kenneth Rendell that was on consignment, and he scavenged it so he could manufacture and deliver on facsimile number 2 as part of the McClellan collection. October 11th, 1985 was the day that Hofmann was supposed to transfer the McClellan collection to Steve Christensen to be verified for Sorensen so he could buy it. And on that day, Christensen had to track down Hofmann to even get in touch with him. And he couldn't. He couldn't talk to him. Hofmann wouldn't answer the phone. Turns out Hofmann was busy that day meeting with Gordon B. Hinckley to try and sell him the Kinderhook plates with a Joseph Smith translation. And of course, the Kinderhook plates is just that's a story for another day. But Hinckley had denied the purchase. He didn't want to buy it. So the day for transferring the McClellan collection was rescheduled to October 15th, the same day that Hofmann was supposed to close on his new $500,000 home in the Cottonwood area of Salt Lake City. In the meantime, Kenneth Rendell was due to return home from his honeymoon and meet with Christensen to talk about the papyri in the McClellan collection. Hofmann knew about this meeting and knew that it would only take Rendell looking at the papyri he had sold to Hofmann, who turned around to forge it into facsimile number 2, to expose Hofmann to the larger world of antique document collectors. Hofmann knew if the meeting between Christensen and Rendell happened, it was all over. From initial appearances, it looks like Hofmann tried to target Rendell upon his return home from the honeymoon. A woman named Leslie Kress, who was Rendell's secretary, took a phone call from a male caller named Mr. Thornton. Mr. Thornton claimed that he was a good friend of Rendell and had a gift to send him if he could only have Rendell's home address. The secretary found the phone call to be odd and refused to give the man the address, and instead she hung up and called the police to report the phone call of the man with the kind of high-pitched voice claiming to be Mr. Thornton, asking for the home address of Rendell. Now, Friday, October 11th, marked the beginning of a long weekend for multiple people that were centered around Hofmann's deals. I'm going to read an excerpt taken from pages 266 through 69 of a book called The Mormon Murders by Steve Naifeh and Gregory White Smith. It was published less than a year after Hofmann's plea bargain was reached, and I think it captured the chaos much better than I've described it at this point. There's a link for the book in the show notes, and I recommend following it to get an idea of a bunch of first-person accounts in this troubling time in Mormon history. Reading from 266 of the Mormon Murders, quote, "Later that day, Al Rust returned earlier than expected from his fishing trip to Boulder Mountain and called Steve Christensen. If at all possible, Christensen wanted to complete the McClellan transaction that day and not wait until the following Tuesday. He called Hugh Pinnock, who canceled his plans to go away for the weekend. David West was put on alert. For a few hours, it looked as if the deal might go through, but Christensen couldn't find Mark Hofmann. He wasn't the only one looking. Brent Ashworth wanted his money. 'I have it,' Hofmann said again over the phone that morning. Ashworth was blunt. 'You bring it to me. I'm tired of trying to chase you down.' Mark said he would be there about noon, and Ashworth told him to leave the money in the mailbox at his house if no one was home. When Ashworth returned from lunch with his family at a nearby pizza parlor, he looked in the mailbox. Nothing. Lynn Jacobs wanted his money. He had provided the collateral for the loan from Hoffman's orthodontist client, Ralph Bailey, and felt entitled to some of the profits from the sale of the letters that Bailey had financed. In fact, he had his eye on a fabulous 1972 Jaguar that he had seen in the showroom of a local dealership. Mark said he would meet him there with $10,000 the following Monday, October 14th. Ken Woolley wanted his money. A week had passed and Hofmann hadn't repaid the $20,000 loan, and he hadn't called. Woolley phoned him to demand the money. He had learned there was no other way with Mark. "The transaction isn't completed yet," Hofmann said. "The buyer hasn't returned to Salt Lake yet, so I'm still waiting for my money." Tom Wilding wanted his money. He had come into the office early that morning for a meeting with Hofmann, but Hofmann hadn't shown up. He tried calling Mark on his car phone. No answer. Finally, about 11:30, Hofmann called. Wilding had only one question. "Do you have my money?" "No, the transaction has been put off until Monday." Wilding was out of patience. "I think you better come up and see me, Mark. We need to talk about this. You've been promising dollars for so long. We're sick and tired of what's going on." Hofmann pleaded, "The transaction has just been put off until Monday. I have something I think will suffice for the weekend." When Hofmann got to Wilding's office, he laid a piece of paper on his desk. It was a letter on David West's letterhead confirming that $185,000 had been placed in an escrow account. Below the statement signed by West was another statement on a different typewriter, noting that the funds would be available on October 15th. It was signed by Stephen F. Christensen. "You see," Hofmann said, "everything is in order. The transaction is going to take place." Wilding wanted to show the letter to his lawyer, John Ashton. He and Hofmann went together to Ashton's office. "Well, I know Steve Christensen," said Ashton. "Why don't we just give him a call and verify this?" Hofmann froze. I don't think that's necessary. If you need to do it to verify the deal, let me do the talking while you listen." A little suspicious, right? He said he was afraid that anything else might cause some concerns, and he rolled out the big gun, possibly even stop the transaction from going through. "Well, we'll give you a little bit of time," said Ashton, trying to screw the word little into a threat. If Hofmann didn't come through with the money, he now had a weapon to threaten him with. "I'll have the money for you on the 14th, Hofmann vowed solemnly. Al Rust wanted his money. On Saturday, Hofmann came into his store and announced, "We finally got the McClellan collection settled. We've got a buyer for the collection, but for a lot less than before. It's $185,000, and we're selling it to a man who's mission president in Europe." That was Sorensen. Rust had heard so many stories, he gave this latest one little credence. But Hofmann was persistent. "Now the money will be sent immediately," he said. "It will probably be here Wednesday or Thursday. Are you going to be here Wednesday or Thursday?" "Oh, yeah," said Rust, relaxed after the serenity of Boulder Mountain. "I'm here all week." "I'll keep you informed, but it's definite. We will have the money." Well, thought Rust, one way or another, it will all be settled by November 1st. End quote. Hopefully, we're beginning to see what life was like for Hofmann. He had promised too much and simply couldn't deliver. He'd reached a breaking point where he couldn't deliver on the McClellan collection or any of the other deals that were still in the works. The Library of Congress had basically rejected the oath of a freeman by this point with too many questions about its authenticity and how Hofmann had come to possess such a rare document. Rendell and Christensen were about to meet and talk about the papyri that made up the facsimile number 2, which Rendell had sold to Hofmann, that Hofmann used to scavenge together to forge the facsimile. I mean, Christensen probably knew that Hofmann was a fraud at this point, but if Rendell found out, it would blow the whole thing apart. Everything was chaos for Hofmann. He was on the verge of being discovered by multiple people in multiple ways at the same time. He'd been doing this runaround game we just heard from Mormon Murder's book for too long. Everything was quickly approaching a breaking point. Brent Metcalf, who was, had been fired by Stephen Christensen and was working for Hofmann at the time, attempted to cash a paycheck for the amount of $1,000. Now, this was a small fraction of the money that Hofmann owed Metcalf for wages, but he had been hounding Hofmann for a few weeks about getting some money for his work, and when he tried to cash this check for $1,000, it bounced. And Metcalf decided to go to Hoffmann's home to demand the money for his employment. On the evening of Saturday, October 12th, Metcalf and his wife, Jill, went to Hoffmann's home, only to find him absent. However, Hoffmann's wife, Dory, was there and told them that he had just gone to his attorney's office to write his will. His will. We'll come back to that in a minute. But Metcalf called the attorney's office and didn't get an answer, which seemed odd if Hofmann and his attorney were supposedly there working. Brent and Jill Metcalf left Hoffmann's home and went back to try and revive Brent's stalled vehicle to no avail. But before going home that night, they decided to swing back by Hoffmann's home one last time to try and find him to get that money out of him. Jill accidentally missed the turn to get into the neighborhood, into Hoffmann's neighborhood, and instead drove a couple of blocks down to turn around in the church parking lot nearby. Lo and behold, serendipitous as could be, Hoffmann's sky blue Toyota MR2 was sitting in the corner of the church parking lot, with Hofmann sitting in the driver's seat. They pulled up next to the car, and Brent got out of it and went and sat in the passenger seat of Hoffmann's car. At the time, Hofmann had a bunch of papers in his lap that he just haphazardly threw face down on the dash. Brent and Hofmann talked for some time about payment, and Hofmann told Brent that he had received a death threat that day. A man reportedly told Hofmann, "You're gonna die. I'm gonna kill you." That's a quote, apparently. But Brent found this death threat somewhat hard to believe because Hofmann notoriously never answered his phone. What are the chances that the one time he did answer his phone that day, the person on the other end of the line would issue a death threat? Regardless, Hofmann seemed very agitated and stressed, which was uncharacteristic of him. Brent figured that the papers on Hoffmann's dash were probably his financials, which would explain why he looked so stressed and frustrated at the beginning of the conversation. To get a proper idea for how much pressure Hofmann was under, this is an extract from that same book, The Mormon Murders, that we read from earlier. It quantifies Hoffmann's personal debt extremely well, but I think it's lacking somewhat because all of the values listed are $1985 amounts. Now, I'm going to read the excerpt with the amounts adjusted for today's inflation, so we can get a sense of just how much money Hofmann owed to how many people. We know that Hofmann had a personal debt of $1.3 million, but this just tells us how widespread his web of terrible business deals had reached at this point. And with the values adjusted for today's dollar values, I think it holds a little bit more gravity. This is once again from The Mormon Murders. This excerpt is in the show notes, and I recommend reading it. Quote, "If Hofmann was going over his financial picture that night in the car, it was no wonder his face showed signs of stress. In the next few days, he would be expected to pay $1,017,952 to Wilding's Group, $382,440 to First Interstate Bank, $44,800 to Shannon Flynn, $295,000 to Al Rust, $22,000 to Lynn Jacobs, $12,300 to Brent Ashworth, $380,200 to Schiller Wapner, $243,800 to Ralph Bailey, $413,700 as a closing payment on the quote-unquote marvelously livable house in Cottonwood, and $143,400 in other miscellaneous debts for a total of $2,958,113. Plus, if he didn't pay the Wilding Group by the 16th of October, penalties of $8,950 per day. End quote. With the dollar amounts adjusted for today's dollars, that's nearly $3 million in personal debt, expected to be paid out in less than a week's time. Yet the $1,000 paycheck to Brent Metcalf had bounced. Hofmann was not in control. He was stuck. He'd made countless promises, financial, anti-document or otherwise, that he could not make good on. Let's go back to something Hofmann did earlier. He made his will. At least that's what Dory told us he was doing that Saturday night. Why? Why would he go to the trouble of making a will when he was under pressure to do so many other things? Well, it's not that hard. I mean, people have used this as evidence that he had plans to kill himself, and I don't want to try and posit motives like this, but I think it does help us to get inside Hofmann's mind a little bit when we look at just how stressed he was on this Columbus Day weekend, 1985. Sunday came and went, as did Monday. Steve Christensen had spent the entire weekend with his pregnant wife to try and repair their dying marriage, and she felt like things were beginning to look up, even though Steve was in the middle of bankruptcy filings and losing his business, the CFS, Coordinated Financial Services. And on Tuesday, October 15th, 1985, this is a big day, a woman named Janet McDermott arrived at her office in the Salt Lake City Judge Building. She had the office across the hall from Stephen Christensen, who had recently moved his business into that building. When she got into the office, she saw a small brown package outside of Steve's door with no postage or stickers or anything, just the name Stephen Christensen in all caps written in permanent marker. While she thought it was peculiar, she didn't do anything with it, and Steve arrived at the office just before 8 o'clock in the morning and picked up the package, attempting to take it into his office to open it. Miss McDermott was on her phone in her office when there was a deafening bang in the hallway. Nails shot through her door and impaled the family portrait on her desk and all over the walls in her office. The nails from the pipe bomb ricocheted throughout the hallway, and one even bored through the wall and grazed Janet's leg, drawing blood. Initially, Janet thought there was a rifleman outside, but the explosion was much louder than a rifle shot. Then she heard a child's whimper outside and sprang into action. She ran out of her office toward Steve's office and found the hallway badly damaged and his office door blown off its hinges. As Janet rushed to the doorway, everything became clear. The whimpering that sounded like a child was coming from Steve's exposed chest cavity. His mangled body was lying a few feet into the office, having been blown backwards a few feet by the force of the explosion. In his last few breaths, Steve moaned in anguish, waiting for death to overcome the immense pain from the thousands of cement nails that had ripped through his flesh. Janet began to whimper at the horrific sight in front of her, as her friend lay bleeding out from the trauma of this expertly crafted pipe bomb. Other people began to emerge from their offices nearby, and Janet yelled to the first person that emerged, "Get an ambulance! Somebody is dying!" After a few short moments of guttural moaning from the mutilated form that used to be Steve Christensen, the torture ended and he passed, falling as the first victim of Mark Hofmann's 3 bombings. Barely an hour later, another package was found at the home of Gary and Kathleen Sheets. This package was probably very similar, having Gary Sheets in all caps written on brown paper with no postage or stickers or anything. Kathleen was the only one home, and it exploded instantly upon her picking it up from the wooden footpath toward her garage, killing her just as quickly and effectively as the first bomb had killed Steve. Her mutilated body was found 2 hours later by a passing neighbor. The news went crazy. Was it a terrorist attack? Was it a series of hired assassinations from business deals gone awry? Nothing I can say right now would properly describe the feelings of confusion and anxiety stemming from these bombs going off in quiet little Salt Lake City. I'm going to read a few excerpts that I was able to pull up on Google's newspaper archives for that day. You can pretty much pick any newspaper at random on October 16th, 1985, go to the national news section of the paper, and find an article covering what happened in Utah with the bombings. This first one is out of the Freelance Star out of Virginia. It says, police probe twin bombing. Salt Lake City AP. Dozens of detectives seeking leads on twin bomb explosions that killed 2 people in a professional-type hit focused today on a financially troubled company and its nearly 3,000 investors nationwide. These are our suspects, said Salt Lake County Sheriff Captain Bob Jack, waving an inch-thick computer printout of investors in CFS Financial Corp. The sophisticated bombs, which exploded Tuesday some 10 miles and 3 hours apart, instantly killed a former officer and the wife of the company's founder and president. On September 26th, CFS Financial mailed to its clients, mostly wealthy professionals, a letter saying the financial counseling and investment company was $5.4 million in the red and could not pay its obligations unless creditors granted additional time. In recent months, disgruntled investors have filed a flurry of lawsuits against CFS, which has formed a committee to deal with its financial plight. Wooden boxes containing the bombs bore the names of Stephen F. Christensen, 31, killed outside his 6th-floor office in the downtown Judge Building, and J. Gary Sheets, whose wife, Kathy, a 50-year-old mother of 4, died when she picked up a newspaper atop a box outside the couple's suburban home, police said. The next one I'm going to read is out of the LA Times, October 16th, 1985. 2 die in Utah bombings that appear linked. A financial consultant and the wife of his former business associate were killed Tuesday in separate but apparently related explosion that rocked a downtown office building and a suburban home. Police said an electrically triggered bomb exploded in the arms of Stephen Christensen at about 8:15 outside his 6th-floor office. A witness told police that she earlier saw a box outside Christensen's office and that it evidently went off when he picked it up. Christensen, 31, formerly worked with J. Gary Sheets, whose home in suburban Holiday was the site of a second explosion 3 hours later. Police said Sheets' wife, Kathy, died instantly when she picked up a similar package on her front porch. Authorities said Sheets was at work when the blast occurred. Sheets owns Coordinated Financial Services. Business Acquisitions said on Tuesday that the CFS has been incurring heavy losses, and according to the Utah Department of Business Regulation, 3 officers, including Christensen, resigned last summer. Police say they are investigating the possibility that CFS's business problems may have been a factor in the bombings, but Salt Lake City Police Chief Bud Willoughby said he did not rule out a religious motive. Christensen was in the news in 1984 when he had purchased a letter written in 1830 by Martin Harris, who was a close associate of Mormon church founder Joseph Smith. In that letter, Harris had written that Smith told him of a white salamander which turned into an old spirit, rebuffed Smith's first attempt to obtain gold plates that were later, allegedly, translated into the Book of Mormon. Headline: Religious Controversy. The letter was controversial because the official Mormon church story of the gold plates, based on accounts of Smiths in the 1830s, was that an angel named Moroni had this role, not a salamander, a popular figure in legend and folk magic. The discovery, in connection with other new findings, has raised new questions about Smith's accounts of the church's origins. A friend of Christensen, architect Alan Roberts of Salt Lake City, said Sheets helped Christensen finance the study of the salamander letter by a 3-man research team. Like Christensen, Sheets is a bishop, equivalent to a pastor, in the church. They also had plans to commission a book, but the idea was later dropped. The document was announced last spring to be genuine by leading Mormon researcher Dean Jesse. About the same time, Christensen donated the document to the church, which thanked him. Bill Curry reported from Salt Lake City and John Dart from Los Angeles. And finally, this is out of the Deseret News for October 16th, and the first 6 pages of this are nothing but the bombings, so I'm just going to have to pick and choose a few paragraphs here and there that are really fascinating and, kind of tell us about this. So this is front page headline: Officers sifting evidence for clues to killer and motive in fatal bombings. Suspicious package triggers an alarm, by Jerry Spangler and Brett Del Porto. As investigators probed Wednesday for clues in Tuesday's 2 bomb slayings, murders they believe may have been carried out by a professional killer with ties to organized crime, police were kept hopping by reports of suspicious packages, including one to the first victim. A task force of about 30 local and federal law enforcement officers have many leads but no suspects in Tuesday's slayings. The sophisticated bombs, however, point in one direction. The way the bomb was made, the way it was handled and detonated, the individual who put it together had to be a professional, said Salt Lake City County Sheriff N.D. Hayward. Investigators are also probing the business dealings of the financially troubled CFS Financial Corp., one possible link between the deaths of Stephen Christensen and Kathy Webb Sheets. When that type of money is flowing back and forth, there's always the possibility of organized crime, and we're looking at that, Hayward said. Christensen, 596 West Mountain View Road, Centerville, a former officer of the financially troubled CFS Financial Corp., was killed about 8:15 a.m. Tuesday when a booby-trapped bomb hidden in a cardboard box exploded as he picked up the package outside his office door in the Judge Building in downtown Salt Lake City. Sheets, 4630 Naniloa Drive, wife of Christensen's former business associate and CFS chairman J. Gary Sheets, was killed at her holiday home about 9:20 a.m. when she picked up a similar package addressed to her husband. Her body was not discovered for another hour and a half. Both were killed by what police say were sophisticated anti-personnel bombs, probably planted by paid killers. Next headline: Police believe the bombings that killed 2 are connected, by Kathy Fahey and Jerry Spangler. Police say there's little doubt that killings Tuesday in Salt Lake's businessman Stephen F. Christensen and Kathy Sheets, a holiday housewife and mother of 4, are connected. Their tragic deaths are similar, but the victims of the 2 gruesome bombings have much more in common. Both were greatly loved by their friends and neighbors. Both were known for their compassion and were deeply religious individuals. And the factor that may have led to both killings, both had ties to the same investment firm, CFS Financial Corp. Christensen is a former official, Mrs. Sheets, through her husband J. Gary Sheets as a current CFS officer. But Wednesday, people were remembering the quality lives the victims led and trying to understand why Stephen Christensen and Kathy Sheets were tragically murdered, leaving 7 children without a mother or father, and another as yet unborn child who will never know his father. Stephen Christensen was a bishop in the Church of the Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, serving in the Centerville 13th Ward. He was also an avid historian, spending considerable time and money pursuing his interests in Mormon historical documents. In January of '84, Christensen purchased what has become known as the Salamander Letter, written by early LDS church member Martin Harris, which gives a different account of how church founder Joseph Smith Jr. obtained the gold plates from which he translated the Book of Mormon. J. Gary Sheets was part owner of the letter, which is now owned by the LDS Church. The letter created a ripple among church historians when its contents were made public. Christensen, however, considered the letter a tool that would help researchers working on a book about the history of the Book of Mormon, rather than something that might cast doubt on the credibility of Smith. While the financial connection is considered the strongest lead, police are also investigating the possibility that Christensen's death may be connected in some way to the Salamander Letter, that someone disgruntled with its contents or public release may be responsible for the killings. Despite the controversial nature of the document, which put Christensen in the public spotlight at the time, he was deeply committed to Mormonism. He was a believer all the way through, said Brent Metcalf, a historical researcher and close friend of Christensen. He was a believer who believed we need to be honest and open with what we find, and it will make our faith stronger. He was probably the most loving and generous person I've ever met, without question, said Metcalf. There really are thousands more articles that I could read. I mean, seriously, just do a search through the Google Newspaper Archives. Look at the photocopies of these newspapers. Pick any one of the newspapers at random. Go to the National News section of October 16th, 1985, and I can almost guarantee you that you're going to find an article on this. Everybody was talking about this. Not just nationally, too. Canadian, Mexican newspapers, European newspapers, and throughout the UK. Anywhere you look, you can find articles about this. October 15th really marked an unusual day in American history. I mean, Salt Lake City, Utah has always been such a nice, quiet little urban city with nothing like this ever happening before. People were quick to say that it was the mafia or organized crime because, no regular Jack or Jane walking down the street could pull off something like this. But Hofmann was no regular Jack. He was smart, calculating, and sadistic, with little to no empathy for the lives that he destroyed. He left the bombs out in the open. Anybody could have picked them up or stumbled over them. There was no assurance that the bombs would hit their marks, showing callous disregard for any human life. After the bombs went off, Gary Sheets, as the known intended target, went into police custody for his protection. His wife had been killed and he was probably still on the hitman's list. Brent Ashworth, another person who came up a few times in our timeline, was theorized as next possible target, and he, along with his family, was taken into custody for protection as well. And unfortunately, to cap off this tragic string of events, Ashworth's young son, was out riding his bicycle when the police were rounding up the Ashworths to take them into protective custody, and a car hit him on his bike, fatally crushing him. So if death comes in threes, there's our 3 for one day, because the next day would bring headlines of a third bomb going off, which critically injured Hofmann, but didn't fatally wound him. So the next afternoon, Hofmann was attempting to deliver the third bomb to an unknown target. The mercury switches he used for the pipe bombs were very sensitive. If you aren't aware, mercury is a liquid metal, basically. At room temperature, it's a metal that's in liquid form. It's really fun to play with. Toxic, but fun to play with. And it can move around just like any normal liquid. And as soon as it touches two contacts by moving, it completes a circuit, and that triggers the bomb. So once a mercury switch bomb is armed, they're meant to trigger with just the even slightest jostle or a little tiny bump. So Hofmann parked his blue, sky blue Toyota MR2 near 50 West and 2nd North, a couple of blocks from the Salt Lake City Temple. He wouldn't have driven there with the bomb armed because any little speed bump or turn could trigger the explosive. So once he parked, he presumably armed the third pipe bomb he planned to use on an unknown target. He must have left the package on the passenger side floor of the car and then got out of the car, possibly to check the address or maybe to pay for parking or something to that effect, but he returned back to his mid-engined two-door coupe and opened the driver's door. Now, this bomb was different than the one that killed Christensen. The bomb that killed Christensen was surrounded with 2.5-inch long concrete nails to cause the most damage to fleshy humans as possible. Now, the nails themselves aren't made out of concrete, but they are galvanized steel meant to be driven into concrete. They're super, super hard, and they're 2.5 inches long. Some serious nails, and they were taped all around the pipe bomb that Christensen picked up. The bomb that Hofmann had in the passenger seat of his car didn't have the shrapnel or the nails or anything like that, or else Hofmann would not have survived the blast. This bomb was probably intended for like a vehicle's fuel tank or something to that effect. But once Hofmann returned to his car, opened up the driver's door, he reached for the bomb. He had one leg out on the pavement, stabilizing him, with his other leg kneeling on the driver's seat. In grabbing the package, Hofmann must have jostled it or bumped it against a stick shift or against the seat or something like that, and then boom. The force from the exploding gunpowder inside this little tiny pipe bomb ripped the roof and the doors off of Hofmann's car and threw him out into the middle of the road. Blood splattered across the street. His leg was badly bleeding from his kneecap that was essentially blown off by the explosion. One of his fingers was nothing but exposed bone, and he had light powder burns all over his face and chest. But he got off lucky. People walking or driving by instantly surrounded Hofmann and dragged him to the sidewalk to await the arrival of paramedics. The blue MR2 was engulfed in flames. The fire department and the EMTs showed up to take Hofmann, ironically, to the LDS hospital and to put out the fire. The police had the block quarantined off as they brought in bomb dogs from the airport to sniff around the car in the local area to clear it of other possible explosives. When they put the fire out, the police were worried that the water had washed valuable evidence down the storm drains, so they removed the covers and went diving for charred papers and that made their way out of the cab and the trunk of the car. Some of those fragments even included ancient papyrus that Hofmann was using to include in the McClellan collection. When Hofmann arrived at the hospital, they classified him in critical but stable condition, and the police began to question him. Now, as Sandra said in our discussion last episode, he made up some kind of story about a van following him around and that he was sitting in his car when the bomb went off. None of those facts could be verified by the police, and even more, Hoffman's placement in his car didn't make sense with the mechanics of the bomb going off. If Hofmann would have been sitting in the driver's seat of his car and picked up the package, the blast would have been contained enough inside the cabin of the car to kill him instantly. Now, to illustrate this, and what I mean here, it's like hitting a bullet with a hammer, okay? I don't recommend doing this. This is an official statement from Naked Mormonism Podcast. Do not hit bullets with hammers. But when you hit a bullet, a full cartridge with a hammer, the cartridge fires and it sends the bullet a few feet before it just falls to the ground. In order for a bullet to have killing power, the explosion from the cartridge needs to be contained inside the receiver and the barrel of the gun. If Hoffman's driver door would have been closed with him sitting in the driver's seat, the explosion would have been much more contained, and the energy from the gunpowder likely would have killed him, kind of like a cartridge exploding inside the chamber of a gun. Instead, the driver's door was open, just releasing all of that energy, and Hofmann was partly out of the car already. So all that really happened was the explosion sent him flying across the street. Hoffman's claim that he was sitting in the car and picked up the bomb didn't mesh with the crime scene, nor did the claims of a mysterious white man. The police considered his faulty testimony to be probable cause to search his home. Now, up to this point, nobody was allowed into the basement of Hoffman's home. It was basically his laboratory, or some may call it like a secret lair. He was conducting all of his fraudulent business from the basement of his home where his document forge and rare book collection were found. When the police conducted a search of the Hofmann home, they found large amounts of scrap paper, many possible forged documents that Hofmann was working on, many vials of old-fashioned ink that Hofmann had personally made, and then various bomb-making materials along with his Uzi. Now, the Uzi wasn't connected to any crimes, nor was there any reason to suspect that Hofmann would use it in the coming days, but it was illegal to own an automatic weapon without a permit, and Hofmann was kind of a gun nut. So this Uzi actually served to be the legal stance that the prosecution took to hold Hofmann in custody until they could gather enough evidence to consider him the primary lone acting suspect in the bombings from the previous day. The final thing the police found in Hoffmann's basement was a green Letterman's jacket. This is important because a witness reported a man walking into the judge building the previous early morning holding a package wearing a green Letterman's jacket. He gave the police an accurate description of Hofmann. The picture the sketch artist created nearly perfectly matched that of Hofmann the morning before the bomb went off in Christensen's office. Finding all of this evidence, the police were able to return to the press the same day and tell them that they have the primary suspect in custody mere hours after the bomb went off in Hofmann's car. Newspaper articles were printing all over the entire nation on the following day, October 17th, 1985. It's not often that something happens, a terrorist attack like this happens, and instantly the suspect is caught, the following day. So this was a really unique case, and newspapers loved it. National newspapers everywhere picked this up and ran with it. So I'm going to read a few of these here, and they're just fascinating. The first one I'm going to read is from the New York Times, actually. The headline is, Mormon researcher injured in third Utah bombing. Salt Lake City, October 16th. A bomb exploded in a car near the Mormon temple today, critically injuring a 31-year-old researcher who helped acquire a document that challenges accounts of early church history. 2 people killed in similar bombings Tuesday were also connected with the acquisition of the document. Mark Hofmann, the researcher injured today, was hospitalized in critical condition, said Lieutenant Bill Gray of the City Police Department. Mr. Hofmann worked with church documents. Lieutenant Gray said Mr. Hofmann had just gotten into his sports car parked near Temple Square when a bomb under his seat exploded, ripping the roof off the auto and propelling him into the street. Police officers with search warrants searched Mr. Hoffman's car tonight, and Lieutenant Gray said they found materials similar to those used in the bombings Tuesday. A search of Hoffman's home was underway late last night. Bud Willoughby, the chief of police in Salt Lake City, said at a news conference tonight, "We know what's behind this and who the players are." Jerry Miller, an agent of the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, said at a news conference tonight that 3 other people may have been targeted for bomb attacks. Efforts to obtain letter. Friends of Mr. Hoffman said he had an appointment Tuesday with Stephen F. Christensen, 31 years old, a stockbroker who was killed that morning by a bomb left in front of his office in a downtown building. Kathy Sheets, 50, was killed at her home later Tuesday by a bomb apparently intended for her husband, J. Gary Sheets, a business associate of Mr. Christensen. Both Mr. Sheets and Mr. Christensen were Mormon bishops, and both were involved in efforts to determine the authenticity of the document. Mormon bishops are similar to lay ministers. The document, which runs counter to church accounts of how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints began, is a letter purportedly written in 1830 by Martin Harris, an early church follower. Mr. Christensen, assisted by Mr. Hofmann, had purchased the letter and donated it to the church leaders in 1984. Officers investigating the bombing said today that they were concentrating on the victims' ties to the document. Until today's blast, police had been looking into whether the explosions on Tuesday were aimed at present and former officers of CFS Financial Corp., a faltering investment company with nearly 3,000 investors nationwide. Mr. Sheets is the founder and president of CFS. Letter challenges doctrine. The letter concerning the church seems to contradict the church's official account of how its founder, Joseph Smith, obtained the gold plates from which he said he translated the Book of Mormon. The book is perhaps the most important volume of Mormon scripture. The church maintains that Smith obtained the plates from an angel and translated them by divine inspiration. Critics of the church long have contended that Smith dealt in folk magic and treasure hunting, and was anything but the prophet Mormons believe in. The letter describes how Smith found the plates by using a seer stone, but initially was denied possession by an old spirit that transformed itself from a white salamander. Historians differ as to the document's authenticity. Richard Lindsay, a spokesman for the Mormon Church, said today that the church would cooperate with the authorities, but declined to speculate about why the bombs were set. Before reading the next one, I just want to point out the articles from yesterday, October 16th, talked a lot about the CFS, the Cooperative Financial Services, and very little ink was actually devoted to talking about the Salamander letter. The next day, after Hofmann is blown up, blows himself up, whatever the case may be, headlines are devoting a lot more ink to the Salamander letter. Not only talking, saying that there's a tie to Mormon historical documents, but actually discussing why the Salamander letter is relevant to Mormon history, and talking about why the white salamander is contradictory to how Mormons claim their history is today, and how the Book of Mormon and the church was founded. So I think it is interesting to see this shift in, just in one day of where the focus is. Next one I'm going to read is from the Daily News, and this is out of, looks like Kentucky. Third Utah bomb injures suspect. Salt Lake City AP. A Mormon researcher critically injured when a bomb accidentally went off in his car was responsible for 2 fatal explosions linked to the Salamander, a disputed account of the church's origins, authorities say. So the last one said, they were searching his house, and we don't know exactly what's going on. This newspaper article goes as far as saying the bomb accidentally went off in Hoffman's car, and he's responsible for 2 fatal explosions linked to the Salamander letter. That's the opening paragraph to this article. And it continues, police said Mark W. Hofmann would be charged today with Tuesday's bomb deaths of a Mormon bishop and the wife of another church history buff. In 1984, Hofmann reportedly sold the bishop, Stephen F. Christensen, 31, a document called the Salamander Letter, which challenges official accounts of the church's founding. Hofmann was blown from the parked car downtown Wednesday afternoon. He was listed in critical but stable condition in the intensive care ward of LDS Hospital, where he had been in surgery most of the night, a nursing supervisor said. We're looking at a revenge motive right now, Jerry Miller, agent in charge of the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, said late Wednesday, although he declined to elaborate. I think the community is safe at this time, Miller said. I think we have the people responsible off the street. Tomorrow morning, we will present information to the U.S. Attorney charging Mark Hofmann with violation of federal firearm laws and explosives laws, Miller said. Searches of Hoffman's bombed-out car and suburban home found evidence linking him to Tuesday's bombings, police said. Hofmann is a former Mormon missionary and a dealer in historical documents. Police held out the possibility that others may have been involved in the bombings which killed Christensen and Kathleen Sheets, the wife of J. Gary Sheets, a former business associate of Christensen's, who helped fund a $20,000 study to determine the authenticity of the Salamander Letter. We are not saying the investigation is concluded, but we feel we know who the players are now, and we're pursuing those, Police Chief Bud Willoughby said. And if we develop that, I would anticipate other charges would be filed involving other than Mr. Hofmann. The Salamander Letter, which Hofmann reportedly sold to Christensen for $40,000, questions official accounts of how founder Joseph Smith acquired gold plates he claimed to have translated into the Book of Mormon, the faith's most treasured scripture. Christensen turned the letter over to the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in early 1984. Its authenticity is a matter of debate among historians. In the wake of Tuesday's explosions, police had said they were focusing their attention on financially troubled CFS Financial Corp., a financial counseling and real estate investment company founded 12 years ago by Sheets. Christensen had been an officer of the company until this summer. But authorities also began looking at the Salamander Letter connection, and said they were searching for Hofmann as a suspect when the apparently accidental explosion occurred Wednesday afternoon. We were out looking for him just before this happened, said Salt Lake County Sheriff Pete Hayward. Hoffman matched the description of a man seen delivering a package to Christensen's downtown office shortly before the stockbroker was killed by the first explosion, Hayward said. 3 hours later, Mrs. Sheets bent down to pick up her newspaper on top of a parcel bearing her husband's name, touching off the second blast. On Wednesday, a man matching Hoffman's description was seen entering a downtown building housing the offices of Christensen's attorney, Willoughby said. The same building was searched after the first two bombings. Another witness then saw Hofmann carrying either a box or a briefcase in his hand when he opened the door to his nearby car, the chief said. When he started into his car, he was blown away from the car. The blast also blew the roof off the late model sports car. After a search of the vehicle late Wednesday, police said they found evidence linking Hofmann to the previous bombs. Lengths of pipe, a pair of gloves, and a felt-tipped pen. They also found books and documents. There were a large number of what we feel are very expensive documents and books dealing with the church, Willoughby said. So here they devoted 2 paragraphs to CFS, and the rest of it is talking about the Salamander Letter. You know, it's interesting how all it takes is the bombing of Mark Hofmann's own car in order for people to actually talk about where the real case is, or what actually happened. The last article I'm going to read from is from the Deseret News. I like to end with this because it's the church's own newspaper agency. And its front page article is half of the page is a picture of Hoffmann's blue MR2 just torched. The doors are open on it. Everything is just a black and white mess from the fire that consumed the car. The roof is blown completely off of it. And it's like a 1983 or 84 MR2. I mean, it was a brand new car, basically. But the headline says, "Third bomb victim faces criminal charges," which must have blown people's minds. Salt Lake man injured in auto blast is prime suspect in fatal bombings. Authorities said Thursday they will seek criminal charges against Mark W. Hofmann in connections with this week's fatal bomb explosions, as speculation surfaces the bombings are tied somehow to a forgery operation involving historic Mormon documents. None of them had said forgery up to this point. This was the first time that we see that word cropping up in any of these articles. Hofmann was critically injured Wednesday when a bomb, the third in 2 days, exploded in downtown Salt Lake City. Revenge, perhaps fueled by business deals gone sour and possibly connections with a forgery operation, are motives police are investigating in connection with Tuesday's bombing murders of 2 Salt Lake area residents. If forged documents are involved, some observers don't think the so-called White Salamander letter is among them. The letter was written in 1830 by Martin Harris, an early witness to the Book of Mormon, and investigators believe the document may have been central to the case. Leonard Arrington, Lemuel Red professor of Western history at Brigham Young University, said, documents discovered previously by Hofmann have been authenticated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he doesn't believe there are any forgeries. We have accepted as authentic the Martin Harris letter, the Lucy Mack Smith letter, the Joseph Smith copy of characters, and the Joseph Smith blessing on his son, all of which Hofmann brought to light. I personally have no doubt that they are authentic. If only Leonard Arrington knew. That's all I'm going to read. The first 7 pages of this are just pictures of Mark Hofmann and of his car, of the paramedics wheeling him off into an ambulance. I'm going to try to include links in the show notes to all of these articles because they're all just as fascinating as the last one. So, this may not have captured everything that the mindset that people had at the time. It may not enlighten us to how it felt to be living in Salt Lake City at this time, or to be associated with Mormon history and think, oh, maybe I'm going to be the next target. Like Sandra Tanner said in the interview last episode, she called the police chief and said, do we have any reason to worry? Because we are basically the ones that exposed the Salamander letter we're claiming the Salamander letter isn't, true. And the police chief said, no, you have nothing to worry about. And he chose his words very, very carefully. But Hofmann was the prime suspect, and so far the only suspect that we can understand that was actually connected with any of this. Hofmann, he's been painted as many things. Criminal mastermind, killer, murderer, master forger, bomber. All very negative terms, none of which are false. I have a few words of my own that I use to describe him. I'll get to those in a minute. But I want to ask a question that has no answer. What drives a person to kill somebody? I consider myself a humanist in every sense of the word, and I can't think of any situation where killing another human being is justified or righteous. You may say, well, what if somebody killed your wife and your kids and your parents and your brothers and sisters? Would you be justified in killing that person? No. Nor was their killing of my family justified in the first place. Killing another human being can never be considered the right thing to do. Oh, well, what if he says you have to kill somebody or else they'll kill your whole family? Well, that person is evil in the first place for threatening to kill my family. The loss of human life is never a good thing. And the person taking that life can never be justified in doing so. But the problem here is I'm a rational human being, and I can't picture my life ever being in a situation where killing another human being is justified. That's a product of my upbringing and current situation. There are plenty of real-world situations where killing somebody seems justified within that situation. Living in Syria as a member of the Kurd army holding off the advance of ISIS. Seems justified to kill somebody then. Living in Russia, annexing parts of Ukraine to fend off aggressive NATO expansionism. Might seem justified to kill somebody. Living in rough parts of Chicago or East LA or some gang-ridden area when an invading gang does a drive-by shooting of your homie's crib or something. Might be justified in killing somebody. In all of these situations, people find themselves justified in killing another human being for the sake of their own survival. Me growing up in perfect little bountiful Utah with nearly zero gang-related violence and currently living in Seattle in very affluent parts of the city, I'm not exposed to any of the situations described. I could never put my mind in a place where I could justify killing another human being. The problem with these labels that I listed earlier is Mark Hofmann wasn't a murderer until October 15th, 1985. He was born in 1954. That's nearly 31 years he spent as not a murderer, only to be remembered as nothing more because of a few rash decisions. Now let me wrap this into something contemporary for a second, to try and describe my perspective a little bit here. I was watching a video online recently of Trump's daughter Ivanka, and she told a little anecdote that made me cringe to think about. She said that her and her dad, Donald, were walking down the street one day, and Donald pointed to a homeless man on the street and said, "That man is $5 billion richer than I am," implying that Trump Industries were that deep in debt at the time. Yeah, come to think of it, I think it was like John Oliver's segment or something, but the point I'm making is Donald Trump has an army of lawyers. He agrees to terrible business deals, usually leveraging other people's money and making all kinds of wild promises that he can never deliver on. And when his financial world begins to collapse, he files for bankruptcy, as he's done 6 times in the last 20-something years, and somehow he gets off scot-free. He digs himself into a bottomless pit, declares bankruptcy, and then the world is all fine again. He finds his way back to the top and then builds more buildings with other people's monies, continuing to do horrible business deals. The thing is, Trump deals in real money with real estate, and his army of lawyers will always be there to find the proper loopholes to save him when he digs in too deep. Hofmann, on the other hand, dealt with real money, but in fake documents. He was selling a commodity that he couldn't outsource or hire out. He was solely responsible for his own success or failure. He dealt in huge numbers, accruing a total of nearly $3 million of today's money in personal debt from his business deals spanning the 5 years from 1980 to 1985. When Hofmann made deals to deliver on an old document, it was up to him and him alone to make good on that delivery. There was no way he could file for bankruptcy and have the people he'd already made deals with just back off. Now, filing for bankruptcy in Hofmann's case may have relieved a little bit of stress with some of the creditors, but it wouldn't make anybody stop asking about documents that he had yet to forge. His bankruptcy wouldn't stop people from asking about the McClellan collection or the Oath of a Freeman or really anything else that he was working on. Sitting back and, thinking about this, there really wasn't any possible way for Hofmann to get out without facing the music. The only solution he had was to come clean, and nobody in the con game does that. Nobody, when they are running a fraud business, comes clean, and I don't think Hofmann ever had the intention of doing so. If he wasn't going to come clean and wasn't able to relieve the pressure by filing for bankruptcy, what could he possibly do to continue to provide for his family the lavish lifestyle that he created by continuing to do what he knew and loved? No solution comes to mind. No alternate business model works for Hofmann. Many have called Hofmann the greatest forger of our modern times. I would argue that the greatest forger has never been caught, but that's neither here nor there. Hofmann had a passion, and he was able to make a very comfortable living by using his passion. He loved history, loved old books and documents, and loved even more deceiving people. He was amazing at his passions. Since Hofmann refuses to meet or interview with anybody, we'll never get to ask him what was going through his mind, whether it was manufacturing the Anthon transcript, selling the Salamander letter, or hearing that his friend Steve Christensen had been horribly murdered by a bomb that he had created the night before. We will never know what was going through Hofmann's mind. What we can say is, Hofmann loved the game. In 2010, an audio tape emerged from some of Hofmann's belongings. This audio tape includes one of his cons in action. I'm going to play it. The audio quality is terrible, but it was first played at Sunstone Symposium in 2011, I believe. and I'll leave a link to the entire hour and 40-minute long presentation so you can listen to all of the audio that Hofmann recorded. But just to describe it, so you know what you're going to hear, it starts out with Hofmann talking to a woman that worked with the RLDS Archive Collections Department. He begins with saying, "This is Mark Hofmann of Salt Lake City. You remember me from the Anthon transcript," and the woman responds friendly. After that, he tells her that he's found a new document that may be of interest to the RLDS Church. The Joseph Smith III blessing, which we talked about in part 1 of this show. He goes on to read the entire transcript to her. She asks how he came to possess such a letter, and he goes on to describe that it came from the Bullock collection. After that, he asks for a copy of the 1833 Book of Commandments in exchange for the letter, which surprises the woman because the books are so valuable. But remember, this blessing that Hofmann had forged stated emphatically that the RLDS Church was the true church in following Joseph Smith III after Joseph's death in mid-1844. So the blessing was quite valuable to the RLDS Church as well. The only reason I told you what you're about to listen to is because the quality really isn't great and it's hard to understand at times. At about 3.5 minutes in, you're going to hear some laughing, and those are people that are attending the Sunstone Symposium presentation where it originally aired. And I don't have rights to this. I'm using this for educational purposes only. Please look in the show notes for the link to the Sunstone Symposium presentation. Listen to the entire thing. It starts at about minute 35 throughout the presentation. Without further ado, this is the audio recording of Mark Hofmann that he made during his phone call to Madeline Brunson.
Hello, this is Madeline Brunson.
Hello, this is Mark Hofmann calling from Salt Lake City.
Oh, yeah.
You may remember me from that Anthon transcript.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the reason why I'm calling is I just came across interesting manuscripts that I thought that were my church might be interested in. It's a blessing that was given to Joseph Smith III by his father. It's dated January 17, 1844. And it's in, according to Dean Jesse, it's in the handwriting of Bullock, Thomas Bullock. So, shall I read it to you to speak better?
This is an original?
Yes, this is an original copy.
Where did you find it?
Well, it was amongst Thomas Bullock papers that were still in the hands of his descendants up in Coalville, Utah.
Okay, now this was
pieces.
this was a blessing to Joseph III
That's right.
on January, what did you say?
January 17th.
1844. By his father?
Yes. I have a written statement also from Dean Jesse saying that in his opinion it's in Thomas Bullock's handwriting.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, okay, let's hear it.
let me read it to you. It's here, this is the title I'm quoting. A blessing given to Joseph Smith III by his father, Joseph Smith Jr., on January 17, 1844. And this is the blessing. Blessed of the Lord is my son Joseph, who is called the third. For the Lord knows the integrity of his heart, and loves him because of his faith and righteous desires. And for this cause has the Lord raised him up, that the promises made to the fathers might be fulfilled, even that the anointing of the progenitor shall be upon the head of my son, and his seed after him from generation to generation. For he shall be my successor to the presidency of the high priesthood, a seer and a revelator, and a prophet unto the church, which appointment belongeth to him by blessing, and also by right. Verily thus saith the Lord, if he abides in me, his days shall be lengthened upon the earth. But if he abides not in me, I, the Lord, will receive him in an instant unto myself. When he is grown, he shall be a strength to his brethren, and a comfort to his mother. Angels will minister unto him, and he will be wafted as on eagle's wings, and be as wise as serpents. Even a multiplicity of blessings shall be his. Amen.
That's that word this is given.
No. On the back of it, there's also a date, the same day, January 17, 1841, Bullock's handwriting, and a notation which Steve Jesse wasn't sure about because there's not enough words, but he said it might very well be Joseph Smith's own hand. And the notation reads, Joseph Smith, 3 blessing.
Joseph Smith what?
And then there's just written out a 3.
Oh, 3. Oh, I see.
So Joseph Smith, 3 blessing.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
So I thought you'd be at least interested in hearing it.
Well, sure, I am. Can we get a copy of that somewhere?
Well, actually, what I was hoping was that you'd be interested in the original.
Oh, well, we are, but it's there in Salt Lake City and
Yeah.
in the Thomas Bullock collection.
Well, it was, but it's in my possession right now.
Oh,
Yeah.
how did you manage that?
Well, I just got the collection. This is one of them. This is the most important item in it. Let's see, there's the Land from Malvern signed by Joseph Smith. And that's the only other novel item. All the rest are from Salt Lake City before 1868. Or Salt Lake, Utah.
Well, I don't understand. Did they just, this was a significant collection to them and you just purchased it from them?
Well, yes, it was in the family is what it was. Not so much, she wasn't a collector as much as he was just the family members had got it. It's one of, there are 37 items, 76 pages in them. And I just bought the whole book.
It was still under the hands of the family then.
That's right.
Oh, I see. I just said, when you said Salt Lake City, you just meant as a location, not the department.
Actually, the collection was in Colville, Utah.
Well, so I suppose you're wanting remuneration then for that.
Well, I was hoping to trade it to you for one of your duplicate copies of the Book of Commandments.
You want the first printing?
Yeah.
Oh, my.
This is pretty important, though.
Oh, well, yeah, it is, but good effort. How can I reach you? What's yours?
Remember. Okay, the area code is 801. Then there is 572 2310.
2310. And I forgot your first name.
Oh, it's Mark Hofmann.
Mark, yes, okay.
Why did Hofmann record this? He was literally putting on record an account of him bargaining to trade one of his own forgeries for a nearly priceless book. Maybe, just maybe, this was his adrenaline rush. If Hofmann was an adrenaline junkie like I talked about earlier, maybe this is what made him feel alive. There's a quote from him that I found in a 1988 letter. This is what it says. This is quoting Mark Hofmann. As far back as I can remember, I have liked to impress people through my deceptions. Fooling people gave me a sense of power and superiority. I believe this is what led to my forging activities. End quote. Think of how surprised Madeline Brunson was in that recording when Hofmann read the text of the Joseph Smith III blessing. She wasn't even sure how to react. And when he said that he wanted to trade a book of commandments for it, she said, "Oh my," in complete shock at the request. That reaction right there must have been Hofmann's cocaine. That's what got him high, when somebody found out that he had something valuable and they were simply appalled by his masterful deception. There is a remarkable image that can be seen online. And I think it was first published by the LA Times, but I found it in a Salt Lake Tribune article. But it's possibly the most amazing photo of Mark Hofmann in all of existence. One of his earliest finds was the Anthon transcript that was supposedly stuck between the pages of an old Bible. This photo that I'm referring to features 6 men standing around a table looking at the Anthon transcript with the Pearl of Great Price next to it. From left to right, the 6 men are Mark Hofmann in his mid-20s, N. Eldon Tanner, Spencer W. Kimball, Marion G. Romney, Boyd K. Packer, and Gordon B. Hinckley. The 5 highest leaders in the church at the time are standing around the Anthon transcript that Hofmann had manufactured in his basement weeks before, determining it to be a legitimate document. Spencer W. Kimball even has a magnifying glass in his hand that they're looking at this through. These 5 men were the most revered people in the Mormon church at the time, supposedly ordained as prophets, seers, and revelators, with the power of discernment, able to sense evil if it walks in the room. And here lies a photo of Hofmann deluding and swindling every single one of them. Hofmann grew up his entire life since 1954 revering these men as leaders of the church, and there he was, fresh off his mission, convincing them that something he had forged was a real historical document. If deceiving people or tricking them in some way was Hofmann's crack, imagine what this moment must have done for him. To be surrounded by the highest church leaders with a camera crew and news team asking questions after taking such an iconic photograph. I doubt there was a single moment he had felt higher in his entire life before this picture was taken, and all he could do after that was chase the next biggest adrenaline rush by fabricating the next biggest Mormon document find. So what would I call Hofmann? This takes a lot of thought, because I don't want to stick to the tired terms that he's been called by so many before. Murderer, bomber, madman, scum, forger, swindler, conman, fraud, coward. All of them are much too overused when describing Hofmann, and they just paint too simplistic of a picture. Now, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm venerating him or something here, but what about genius? Imaginative, creative, extremely perceptive, an insatiable student of Mormon history, obsessively attentive to detail in his work, a man capable of orchestrating massive business deals to get whatever he wanted by any means necessary. And finally, Hofmann painted himself into a corner where the only idea he could come up with to get out of the situation was to kill people, thus gaining the label of murderer. Now, this may sound like an odd way to take the conversation right now, but the Amazing Randy is a magician who made his name in exposing other magicians or illusionists that claim to have magical or psychic powers. Randy exposed people ranging from Peter Popoff to Uri Geller to James Hedrick and, many in between. Randy knows the game of deception, but he comes by it honestly. And he tells you that he's a magician or an illusionist, and his entire purpose is to deceive you. He tells you he's deceiving you. I can't help but see some parallels between Randy and Hofmann, minus the people dying bit. That's, pretty big difference there. But my point is, as soon as Hofmann found out that the church was suppressing information and documents about their convoluted history, he embarked upon a decades-long mission to expose this suppression. What if what happened was Hoffmann's plan all along? I mean, think about this. When a corporate scandal involving millions or billions of dollars is uncovered, it hits the media for a week, maybe a couple days, and then it dies off as soon as a royal baby is born, or Justin Bieber flashes his junk to some people, or whatever. This hypothetical scandal involves corporations and millions of dollars. But what if that corporation is a church, and the only scandal involves them paying a few $100,000 for old documents just to suppress them and hide them away in their vaults to keep them out of the public eye? 2 days after that story hits somewhere in the B column of the local newspapers, people don't care. They're just talking about how long it'll take for Gorbachev to tear down the wall, or, the newest developments in the Chrysler workers' strike. 2 weeks after it broke, the story of the church suppressing documents would only stay alive in the hearts of the historians that were affected by it. But as soon as you throw 3 bombs and people dying in little old Salt Lake City and possible corporate mafia hits into the equation, the story gets a lot sexier. Instead of just the Deseret News talking about an antiques document scandal in the B column of Tuesday's newspaper, Every news outlet from the LA Times to the Albany Herald were talking about people dying in explosions in Salt Lake City with connections to Mormon history, featured on the front page of the newspaper for weeks. Call Hofmann whatever you will, but given his fixation with defrauding people and how angry he was at the church for doing the same thing to its members for over a century and a half, Hofmann seemed to have one goal in mind: get everybody in America to talk about Mormon history by any means necessary, and make the church and its leaders look foolish while doing it. In that sense, I have one word to describe Hofmann: victorious. I really wanted to talk about Hofmann's aftermath and what happened in the realm of Mormon historians and scholarship and the legal realm after these bombs went off, but there's just too much to talk about. There's just far too much. We got to do it in a third part. So next week, be sure to tune in to hear the part 3 of this insanely huge and crazy epic episode about Mark Hofmann. I never knew that there was this much, and I don't think there's any way to quantify how much I'm leaving out of this analysis of Mark Hofmann. He's a very fascinating individual. But until next time, I need to close up the episode by thanking a few people. First off, I'll thank Demonista for running the Facebook page. Be sure to check that out. She does a fantastic job of posting up things there. We just hit 1,000 likes, so huge thanks to everybody that played part in that. It's a great milestone to hit. Also need to thank Jason Camo for producing the music that's used in this show with his permission. For more of his music, you can go to aloststateofmind.com. Need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork for this show, as well as the daughter podcast, the Glassbox Podcast. For more of his work, you can check out his blog at weirdmormonshit.com. Also need to thank all of the patrons who support the show. You are amazing for making this a full-time adventure. Thank you so very much. If you'd like to call in and leave a voicemail for the show, call 864-NAKED-MO or 864-625-3366 to talk about the show, talk about your story, previous episodes, corrections, whatever you'd like. Thank you all so much, especially to you amazing listeners, for lending me your ear for so long. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.
Speaking with Richard Turley, also with us Kurt Bench and Dory Olds, we are remembering what happened 30 years ago here in Salt Lake City, the Mark Hofmann bombings, and all of the fallout that followed. And again, if you've got questions or comments, feel free to put them right here on the website or send to the hashtag TribTalk on Twitter. Here's a comment from KB on the website. It sounds to me like Mark is just a psychopath. I still don't understand why he chose to do what he did. If he stopped believing in the LDS Church, why didn't he just stand up and say so? I guess that is a question that has lingered for 30 years. The motive. Why did he do it? Dory, did he ever have discussions with you on the motivation?
We didn't have discussions while we were married or when he was living at home, but he did write some letters to me after he was in prison explaining the reasons. And he had a vindictive energy about him, and some of the things that he felt betrayed by the church when he was young. He felt like he couldn't rebel, he couldn't speak out because of how strict his parents were, and so this is the way that he could speak out and he could express himself, was through embarrassing the church, and that was his plan.